There should be a way to get it like full screen or something, right?
Well, I mean, you mean to say when you click on the link, it does not show up?
If you double tap it, it pulls it up, but it's not any bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you double tap it, it doesn't pull it up any bigger. Oh, shit.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Oh. Looked like it was muted. Okay, well, good. Thank you.
Well, I sure do hope Rick stops by. I gave him a reminder yesterday and everything. He forgot last week. Hey, James.
Hey, David. How are you?
Hey, hot.
Yeah.
I'm hot. That's how I am.
In Chicago?
I'm in California.
Oh, California. That's right. Where I'm at. Southern. You're northern or southern?
I'm in Ventura County, Thousand Oaks.
Oh, great. Oh, okay. It's just a few miles from where I am in the Pasadena area,
Oh, yeah.
Temple City.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like even hotter yesterday. Huh?
Marginally.
Jeez.
Excuse me.
It's worse when you don't have air conditioning.
Yeah, sure. Well, you're at least near the beach, though, right? Near the coast there.
Thousand Oaks. We're about 5-6 miles
Oh, okay.
from
You
the
get
beach.
a little bit of breeze then.
A little bit, maybe. Hey, Andy. You're not up close so we can admire your artwork, Andy. Muted, Andy. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm actually on my art desk right now, just doing some drawing. Really boring stippling.
No, every time we're in a meeting and I see you talk and your artwork is behind you, and I always wanted to say that I was digging it, but we're always in the middle of the session, so you never get a chance to
have that get in the way.
But I am digging the artwork. Very evocative.
You draw for a living, Andy?
What's that?
You draw for a living?
No, I actually do it for many reasons. I don't make money off of it, but I do it for, it's kind of tough to describe because I don't really know exactly why I do it. There's a desire to do it, to create something and to kind of transmute an idea or a concept into a symbol or like a language that kind of goes beneath my rational awareness. And I feel that it's like an exercise that is really good for me because it allows you to process a lot of things in a way that turns it into something that is more corporeal, that is more recirculating back into something more base at a base level. And I really like that, being able to use a language of symbolism, imagery, associations. And sometimes I don't even know exactly what I'm expressing, but I kind of like that in-between zone, the liminal zone of expression, which I think it's good and healthy for everybody to have an outlet like that.
Yeah, I get that. I have my Asperger's for that. I don't have to draw.
That's great, Andy. That's wonderful. I can't draw at all, but that's wonderful. Yeah.
I think everybody's good at something. Just got to figure out what that is, I guess.
Yeah, it's supposed to be very therapeutic, huh?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Kind of reveals aspects of myself and reflections of the culture that I'm kind of swimming in that I wouldn't have access to otherwise too. So like having a creative outlet and going through that process, which is very time consuming and allows for deep focus, definitely kind of like opens me up to certain aspects of myself that I wouldn't be aware of otherwise, which I think it's a good practice as well.
No, I once read an interview, I think it was Scott Adams, who does Dilbert, and somebody asked him, like, eventually you had Dilbert doing this or Capper or whatever. What made you think of that? And he says, I'm as surprised as you, because when you're a cartoonist for so long, the characters catch you by surprise. The ideas after like 5, 6, 7, and on aren't yours anymore. They're the characters. The characters tell you what to do. You know what I mean? It's like the characters are kind of guiding you. So everything they say is not so much a cartoonist idea, it's a character speaking to the cartoonist. And they're usually as surprised as everybody else is.
Yeah, it's almost like a good analogy would be like if you run and for the first 5 or 10 minutes or so, it's really willpower it, will yourself through, grind yourself through. And then you get into a state where it's kind of like running you. You can kind of let go and it just kind of does its own thing. It sprouts its own legs. And I get that when I write sometimes, if I'm like writing in a notebook, just certain thoughts or whatever that's on my mind. It's kind of hard at first, but after the first 10 minutes or so, it starts to write itself. And I'm not even really doing the thinking. It's experienced in that way where like agency is kind of like surrender to something else. I don't know what that is, but it's an experience that is very real. And,
like divine inspiration coming down into the Godhead.
could be.
Yeah, like those various aspects of the self that you're not aware of are expressed and manifested and realized.
Yeah, it's almost like as if something is going on all the time simultaneously with our intellect, and yet we tend to focus only on our thoughts. And yet, if we were to somehow just erase all of the thoughts, and I'm sure there are certain drugs, psychedelics, and things that can do that, where something is happening, there's a modality going on or multiple layers of modalities that are happening simultaneously that we maybe block out because we are shining the laser of our conscious awareness onto the abstract thoughts that we have, and it kind of blocks out the other richness and dimensionality of maybe what is always going on. We just aren't aware of it in a way.
Right.
And maybe getting yourself into that kind of momentum of whether it's a writing, whether it's drawing, playing music, things like that, where there's a kind of a surrendering to something in a way, but it's a careful, conscious surrendering as well. So it's like balancing both the intuition and the intellect in a way where they're kind of dance partners. That's the only way I can get close to describing it.
Right.
It's a sort of self-hypnosis. So the more you get into a project, and I experience it all the time too, it's you get absorbed. So the absorption means that you your mind is also dissociating outside distractions and outside information. And then you don't register, you stop, you're right about the subconscious, you stop registering what you're doing in the conscious mind. So it seems like something is happening automatically by itself, which it does. It does subconsciously.
Right.
I'm wondering if there's like a falling back into like a more earlier proto-rational, proto-conceptual, archetypal kind of patterning that might have oriented our species at an earlier stage of its development. Maybe there's some kind of like falling back into that if you do get into like the zone or the flow state or whatever that is, maybe.
I don't know, but you know,
no idea.
shamanism and still today religious rituals and other rituals that you get into that involve repetitive action, certain music can do it. You don't need any psychedelics, but that gets you to this state of absorption and dissociation. I use it. I'm a consultant in clinical hypnosis. And so in hypnosis induction, that's exactly what you do with the client. And then it's not like they hear, their hearing apparatus of the phone ringing is the same as somebody who is fully, in the office, but it doesn't register in the conscious mind. So they are all focused on what they experience, and that focus enhances the experience, and it makes it very powerful.
Is it tapping into the unconscious mind in hypnosis?
Well, hypnosis is going to another, they say it, another state of mind. It's not like it's a binary process, conscious and subconscious, but it goes to state of subconsciousness, which means not, a consciousness meaning in a meaning of awareness. It's an alternate state of mind. Yeah.
It's almost like a dissolving of ego boundaries, because if you align your awareness with like a rhythm, like a sound that is repetitious, or even a behavior, like a physical action that repeats itself again and again, it almost seems as if like your sense of self is extended onto that rhythm and you become the rhythm in a way. And therefore the ego boundary of like this, the meat suit is almost like extended onto something else outside of it. And so there's almost like a self-transcendence, like a fleeting sense that there's something beyond you, because maybe there's the identification with something beyond you. And I think maybe the trance or the repetition kind of lulls your consciousness into almost like a slumber in a way, where it can allow the ego to surrender itself to that thing in a way.
That's exactly right. And in meditation, this is the experience that people might call oneness. I sometimes experience it in nature, where it feels like an integral. I feel that my entity doesn't have those boundaries, but it's a feature of the whole nature, and it's like you feel like to the blades of grass, like as if you are family, very close, very part of this whole thing. It's a wonderful experience, and that's why it's very empowering. You're not alone, and you're not weak. You're part of a huge cosmos. In art, what you do, or in writing, you feel that what is being written and you are not separate entities too.
Mm.
It's a great experience. It's empowering. People use it. People can get rid of their anxiety, alienation, at least momentarily. You know.
Yeah, there's something about materializing something that exists within you that's like an energy, whether it's anxiety or something like a fear or whatever it is. You may not know exactly what it is, but it is like the exercising of that and turning it into something that's tangible, that almost like channels that energy into something that is physical. And it's almost as if like exercising the demons or whatever on a psychological level, like how it almost seems like you've relieved yourself of that by simply transmuting it into something of form that takes a kind of a physical form.
Mhm.
I think there's something that happens psychologically, like through that practice, that I think can be very beneficial.
Got a message from Rick. He says he's on his way, everyone. So since he's the guy who's doing all of this, we should probably wait. You continue.
Okay.
There are a lot of quite a few philosophers and psychologists now who posit that our consciousness is not isolated within each individual, but it's a panpsychic. It's in nature itself. And you're talking about meditation as being a one with the elements of nature, grass and so forth. So maybe that's a truer experience of consciousness, than what we usually, walk around with and think that we are individual consciousnesses.
Trying to link this to the ideology, which is the main theme here, and how identifying with something beyond ourselves in the abstract plane or the conceptual plane might, for some people, give them a sense of self-transcendence where they submit themselves to some higher order, and the order is the principles of the particular ideological framework in which they've surrendered themselves to, maybe not even knowing it, because in that act, there is almost a sense of, no, this is true. This is true because this is who I am and I exist. And so if there is almost kind of like that melding between one's identity and sense of self and the ideological structure,
right,
there might be this kind of like invisible or not being able to be fully aware that one is simply, like seeing reality through their biased lens,
right.
like not knowing it.
Right.
Maybe that's why it makes it so hard for us to see.
Right. So instead of identifying your consciousness with an organic nature, they're identifying with these ideologies in a capitalist, system that enslaves them to that system.
It's almost like it's tapping into something, some like proto kind of like alignment with something bigger than ourselves, but in the mental plane instead.
Right.
In a way.
Right.
Difference
I don't know if
between
you've heard,
gnosis
there's
and
some kind of
knowledge.
paradox they're uncovering of DMT users that says they'll interview multiple DMT users who had no contact with each other. And they always keep reporting the exact same things, like to the most specific detail, every single one of them. Like go into this room and like everything they describe is exactly the same.
Yeah, I remember reading a book, The Spirit Molecule, it was called. It was on DMT. It was a while back. And yeah, like the studies were pretty much, they were seeing some, I don't know, some green men or something and during their trip that were just hallucinations. But yeah, it seemed like the symbology or whatever images that they were seeing were all kind of consistent, a lot of them, among the various people who were tripping on it. Fascinating stuff.
A lot of the differences we find between the mental and the physical are artificial. I mean, there is no mental activity that's not physical at the same time. And this feeling of oneness has a supporting ideology behind it. I mean, we are all much more connected. We are all forms of life with nature, and forms of, well, even with the inanimate objects. We are much more part of this whole than we are aware on daily basis. We're kind of anthropomorphic. We think that humans are very special, Homo sapiens. But actually, we have so much, well, you know how much in common, DNA in common we have with other forms of life. It's amazing, even with a banana.
I heard someone once explain it that human beings are basically plants with very complicated feelings.
That's right.
Yeah, I think there is something that is often misunderstood regarding those statistics. Like when someone say we are 99% the same as a chimpanzee or something like this, it's not exactly true. We share 99% of the genes, but those versions of the genes are different. So if we compare like all the ATCG, characters of the DNA, they're actually quite different. And that's why when you compare siblings together, if you compare character by character, they only share 50% of the same DNA. So yeah, it's there is really a difference between sharing the same version of a gene and sharing the same genes. Like you can have some genes to code for the eyes, so we share the same with the chimpanzee, but like the human eyes are different from the chimpanzee eyes. And if I have to compare my blue eyes with my brother's green eyes, they will be different. So yeah, there is something to be understood there that is most of the time misinterpreted.
But there are some people who look like a banana, we must admit.
Well, the question is, what are those differences mean? What is the meaning of all the differences? And I
The
think
universe expressing itself
in
in different forms in order to have novel interactions and hoping to create further depths of complexity to continue evolving for its own sake.
Yeah,
I'm just
I'm
thinking out loud
hearing
here.
I'm hearing Carl Sagan now and the Cosmos soundtrack because yeah, this is the stuff he talked about, right?
Mm.
Yeah. Infinite differences.
Well, welcome, Rick. I'm glad you made it.
Thanks, David. Looking
Yeah.
forward to it.
I know. Okay. This was always great to have the conversation, the free form, open forum conversation. Everybody. This week we are covering a very particular essay. What was Kenneth Smith had an email writing group that he would just circulate. What do you call it? A mailing list with a number of participants. And that went on for something like 15 years. It's still sporadically going on and on here and there, nowhere near the volume it was. I mean, I swear to goodness, at one point or another, he was sending like 20 or 30 or 40 emails a week. I mean, just these incredible essays. So this one was actually titled, well, originally it was a response to a magazine article that was about Nazism in modern society. And that's what started that particular thread. And that was the name that just kept throughout. And I didn't want to use that name because we weren't going to deal with the specifics of that particular article. So I discarded the name, even though each email is titled that, Nazism in the Modern Society. So I changed the name to Form and Matter. But what this was a conversation that our friend Rick here had with his father, right? Emailing back and forth, discussing the points that Kenneth raises in these articles, in these emails. And that, in and of itself, led to a tremendous series of emails that Kenneth then responded to. So, Rick, what kind of background would you like to give to us at this time with the communication that you were having with your dad?
So I was trying to introduce my dad to Kenneth Smith's work because I thought he would find it properly challenging and engaging. He's always been an intellectual. He's more of the extreme left brain mathematician, computer programmer side, but he was also very active in the 60s and 70s and to the present day in the civil rights movement. And I thought that the way that Kenneth gets at the relationship between culture and what we do in the world had some illuminating aspects that were missing from Dad's analysis. Dad came out of an ultra leftist perspective. He's came far out of it, but at the time, back in the 60s, you know, he tried out. He said his way of figuring out where he stood politically was to try out every bad idea, find out why it was a bad idea, and then reluctantly move on to a slightly less bad idea. And so, as a result, he's still got a bunch of stuff he carries around from that. And one of the things he carries around is sort of an ultra materialist perspective that says that culture is just some sort of epiphenomena, detritus, leftover, and that the only part you really have to look at is the material conditions and how people develop their economy.
Really?
And I could tell that Kenneth Smith was exactly what Dad needed to be wrestling with, because Kenneth draws on Hegel and Nietzsche, as well as Marx and others, to show how the way that we're acculturated controls the way we see the world to such an extent that we actually aren't making what's the term that people rational self-interested choices about the material world and what we do, right? We think that we're choosing objectively, but we are so culturally shaped by our upbringing that we aren't, in fact, that we're choosing from a very limited palette of things that have been processed through funhouse mirrors that look the way we expect to see them. And so I thought a very productive discussion would ensue from running Dad's ultramaterialism into Kenneth Smith's critique of culture and its influence on us. That's the background behind this, why I started that discussion in that email thread 17 years ago.
You do get that. I like to call it quadrant absolutism, which doesn't make any sense unless you know what I'm talking about when I say the word quadrant. There's self and there's not self. There's me and there's everything that is not me. Okay, those are two categories. But if you just think about it, everything has an objective and a subjective. Everything has an external and an internal. You know, the external of myself is my physical form, my hair, my face, my bones, my tissues, my organs, everything that's physically present. And the physical object of the everything else category is trees and rocks and mountains and continents and planets and galaxies and everything you can touch physically. But there's subjective internal experience, my memories, my emotions, my spirituality, my psychology, everything that's going on subjectively, internally, my reactions, everything. And there's a subjective internal experience for the everything else category as well. And that's our economic, sociological, political, cultural context that we all live in. The internal of a rock would be the law of the jungle. That there is no cultural context a rock has, but America does have a cultural context, and so does Aboriginal tribes in Australia, and so does South American shamans, and et cetera, et cetera. Go in the future, maybe intergalactic federations. There's an economic, sociological, political context, cultural context that we exist in. So that's what I mean by 4 quadrants. Now, the problem is whenever one person or one group or one religion or one ideology, one company, one country thinks that it's all located in one of those quadrants. That's the answer. It's all in one, and you're going to ignore the other three. Or at most, you look at two. But that's the ones that you're ignoring that are the reasons you're going to fail. You're not going to get anywhere. That's quadrant absolutism. So that sounds like what your father was doing. He's only looking at the material side of that map.
Yeah, he would have said that he was taking it into proper account, but that he didn't ignore it completely, but it seemed to me that it had the result of ignoring it completely. I mean, the great challenge for us is that as human beings, our interactions with the world, the material changes we inflict upon the world they don't exist in isolation. Everything happens through a feedback loop between what we see happening around us and the decisions we make about what to do next. And it means that the objective consequences of our actions and the things we build and shape are processed in a loop back through the subjective perspective we have about it before it comes back out into further objective changes. And so as a result, the dance of the subjective and the objective is complete in a human being. We can never strip one of them out and say we could purify ourselves to be only objective, or that we could live an entirely subjective life. We don't have a choice. We're sort of trapped in this dialectic between the two.
Yeah, similar to the two truths doctrine in Buddhism, we have a foot in both worlds. And yeah. It's the makeup of our existence. Yeah, we're stuck between animals and angels. We're here in the middle.
I don't know that there are two worlds. I don't think the separation ever existed. Even as an embryo, you are located in someone else's body and getting all the DNA and all the feed from two other people, your mom and dad or whoever, and the milkman, whatever. And then you are born and into a social context. There is usually another human that takes care of you. So you hear a certain language, you get a certain touch and attitude, and so you are never just an individual or a subject.
Yeah, we're amphibians.
You ever heard? Neil deGrasse Tyson tells a story about his biggest nightmare, the one thing that keeps him up at night. And he says, when you look at DNA, we're only one little thing separated from apes. And see all the things we can do that apes cannot. And then he said, there could be out there in the cosmos some alien species that's one thing separated ahead up above us. So like we could present them like Hawking, may he rest in peace. Obviously, this is a little story. And we could be like, okay, this is Stephen Hawking. He can do equations in his head. And they said, oh, how nice. Here's one of our 3-year-olds. He can do the same thing.
By the way, we tend to think that makes us do all the things that apes can't. But do you know how many things apes can do that we can't?
Yep.
Right. It's a very modernist perspective that we're the best and the brightest and the pinnacle of evolution or creation, and nothing could be better than us. So as a result, when we look in the mirror as a species or a civilization, we turn the dial up to 11 about how great we are. And then when we look at an ape, say a mountain gorilla, we turn the dial all the way down to 0 and say, now that's primitive and savage, but we're enlightened and evolved. And in doing so, we're doing a very modernist thing. I mean, other epochs, the kinds of psychologies they had didn't feel the need to constantly flatter themselves relentlessly at all times. But among moderns, if you don't flatter them constantly relentlessly, they call you a misanthrope and think that you're being cruel and needlessly negative.
Yeah, that's more like, I would say, Western kind of cultural feature or ego feature. But anthropomorphism, we call it now. But actually, if you look at the Old Testament in Genesis, from the very, very first story of creation, man is created in the image of God, and the animals were created on day, I don't know, was it the first day or the second day? And the next day, what God told Adam and Eve is, you know what, you need clothes, you messed up, so rip the fur out of the animals' bodies to make yourself clothes. So what does it mean about the idea that other animals not are just underneath us, but are for our service to eat and to rip? So that's actually, I think, an old embedded thing in this Homo sapiens image, don't you think, Rick?
Certainly, it's a particular relationship to nature that has been a recurring strand in what has led to us. There are other cultures whose relationship to nature treats it more as sacred and us more as having to find a relationship to it that's in harmony. Among the Dene, the Navajo, they talk about walking in beauty and the need to find harmony. And people who live the way that white people live, they call being a skinwalker. That you're a predator upon other human beings, and that you throw yourself out of balance with the world around you. So I think that there have been multiple cultural strands throughout human evolution about how to resolve that relationship between humanity and the other species. But I agree with you completely about the strands that led to us. we have extraordinarily exploitative and nihilist relationship to everything that's not us. So much so that even other human beings throughout much of our history, we've treated as disposable resources to be consumed to make our own lives better.
Predatory.
Yeah, kind of a would-be predator. We imagine ourselves to be wolves, even when we're behaving less functionally than a wolf in that regard.
Can I say something? You know, in comparing species, we're all familiar with the term bird brain, as if birds are stupid, when in fact they're very, very smart. And the success of a species, I would say, is determined by how long they have survived. Birds have survived for tens, if not hundreds of millions of years. We'll be lucky if we survive 500,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, birds date back to the Cretaceous or before. Maybe the Jurassic is the sort of emergent era. But on that, I think that's a brilliant example that you've raised there, Michael. And I'd like to underscore a recent discovery that was made about that. We mock birds for having small brains because even though over and over scientists tell us it's the folding and the surface area that matter and not the volume, we insist on simplifying it to, well, if I've got a bigger brain, I must be smarter, right? And so it came as an enormous shock to a lot of people. Just last year or the year before, there were studies that showed that the reason that birds have smaller brains is that they have smaller neurons. Their neurons, they can, and of course, the important part in thinking is not the size of the neuron, but the number of connections in the synapses. Right. So they're able to pack a higher density of synapses in than we are because we have these large, clumsy neurons that go from place to place, and they have these small, very efficient neurons that have a high density of synapses. So as a result, a much smaller brain can do a lot more than a much bigger brain can do when we're comparing birds to mammals. And this helps to explain why crows are able to do things that in human beings, we associate with being a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or older. It's like, but its brain is so much smaller, but it's got so many more synapses going.
That's interesting.
But also, I think it has to do with the relative sizes, the relative size of the brain as compared with the body size. But the proof is in the scientific testing. And whereas before they thought that birds could not figure out puzzles, in fact, they've been able to show that birds can strategize and figure out multi-step puzzles that practically no mammal could figure out other than people. So they are very smart.
Yeah,
they
I couldn't live without a GPS, but look at the birds' migration patterns.
Right, and they have photographic memories, and that explains how they migrate.
You know, that particular that particular question, I think for me the most stunning experiment that they did is the one where I can't remember if they were wearing Nixon masks or Reagan masks. These researchers put these masks on of a specific president, and then they went out and they were rude. They yelled at the crows. They wouldn't feed them. They threw things at them. And then they waited. And they went to a different part of the city. And they waited generations until those crows had died out. And they put those masks back on and they went out there and they got dive bombed by crows that had never met them.
Yeah.
Only the people in the masks were assaulted by the crows, which means that the crows are able to communicate at a level of detail and specificity that's unimaginable to us because we don't see them practicing abstract language the way we understand it. And yet they were able to communicate the specific image of a face and the hostility of the behavior across generations.
And of course, we associate so-called culture as being exclusive to humans. But in fact, now we know that many species have culture. Different groups of primates, for example, pass on the use of tools, which again is something that we thought only humans could do. So yeah, and as far as language goes, we don't understand the language of other species, but they do have language. Birds certainly have language.
You know, it boils down to the fact that we as humanoids defined what intelligence mean. But as you pointed out, Michael, intelligence is basically problem solving. For what? For the end of survival and well-being. So we have all those capacities and faculties to self-destruct and to hurt each other and to invent trifles that will preoccupy our mind and do all those wonderful things that are included as a subtest in the WAIS-R, in the intelligence test, but they don't mean problem solving. They don't mean survival. That's the anthropomorphic, the centrist kind. One gene that we could have done with a little less of, and that's the ego.
Yes, God help us, our ego is just our prison. I mean, this is something that Heraclitus wrote about 2,500 years ago when he said that the biggest problem with human beings is that we can look right at reality and see something else. And that we, not only that, but when someone tries to tell us what we're looking at, we disbelieve them because we're so sure of the reality image in our brain and we're not skeptical of it, but we're skeptical of the actual reality outside our brain when we should be having faith in that. It's like we've inverted the relationship between which one deserves to have our fidelity. It's like the real world or the way we imagine it. Well, the way we imagine it is, of course, our so we can look right at truths. We can go ahead.
Because we won't be caught being wrong.
Right. We try to deny that we're wrong by insisting that what we've said before was right and warping reality to fit our preconception. So we can look right at crows doing these amazing things all around us in every city all the time. And instead of seeing what they actually are, we see the caricature of them that reinforces our own ego and our ideas about how we're the best and the brightest and they're stupid. It's a perfect illustration of what Heraclitus was talking about, that we could be seeing miracles of intelligence and cultural transmission and completely missing it all.
I wonder if it weren't for our ability to create these like shared collective hallucinations, called culture, I guess, we wouldn't have a civilization, or at least we wouldn't be able to bind enough people together to go beyond just the typical tribal setup of 150 people. And so it almost seems that like it is a survival strategy, but it's not going to give us access to reality, but it's going to give us access to an intersubjective conceptual reality that allows us to, or motivates us towards some end goal that most likely is due to maintaining and allowing the bigger group to survive and keep itself going. But that is what's driving it, I think, is just more of a biological kind of pursuit of just trying to survive and create a stable society. But we like to think, I guess, that this is going to give us access to truth, but that may only be to serve the emotions, and the positive, uplifting emotion of thinking that we have more power than we really do, or more control than we really do. And I'm guessing just even the faculty of reason came way after our ability to emote, to feel sensations and emotions and things like that. So it almost seems as if the extended faculty of like the neocortex is a servant rather than, the master in a way. It's a servant of what came before it. We end up thinking that it's kind of the master, like the top-down king or whatever, that is like dictating all of the body and all of its mechanisms and everything underneath. But it almost seems like the role is really reversed, but we don't want to admit that because our emotions don't want to feel the pain of like the existential anxiety of like, oh no, we're not in control. Everything I think, even the things that I think I know, are all based on an emotional kind of like holding on to a particular comfort of thinking that I know it all and that I have more control than I really do.
Are you talking about church?
About church?
Yeah, a community built on a common delusion that gives a warm, fuzzy,
yeah,
and a
that's
final
one out of
answer.
many examples. But even state, government, it's a shared belief that whether it's money holds value, a certain authority and roles and positions hold value. They don't, but they do if people believe in them and act according to those beliefs. And it does create a sense of structure and order, and it definitely does kind of orchestrate human behavior in a way that creates a little bit more harmony than would be if everyone had their own separate belief.
And it's particularly prevalent today with social media, where even people who traditionally would be asocial or even antisocial now find simpatico, in social media, and that's it's very dangerous to survival of our species.
Yeah, no matter what eclectic views you carry, you're going to find some group that caters to them and reinforces them today. And that wasn't available to us even like 20 years ago. You had to find someone in your own geographical location that would hopefully share some of your beliefs so that you could continue inflating them and feeling comfortable within that safe space.
But there is no social interaction in the world that doesn't require some degree of trust. And trust is a belief that the other wouldn't betray you without the assurance.
Kenneth Smith talks about this issue a bit. He talks about the difference between a culture and an anti-culture. And it's based upon the idea that you're saying, Andy, that human beings have evolved in such a way that we need culture in a very specific way. That even though there's a diversity of cultures and how they solve problems, the need for culture itself is just deep in us. We can't be human without culture in a way that, I think about this a little differently from Kenneth. I mostly agree with him, but I cast it in an evolutionary frame. The way that I think about it is if we're talking about crows or wolves, they have a very rich network of instincts that draws a crow-shaped or wolf-shaped frame around their behavior. And within that, they can innovate and think and do all the things that we can do. But what's very difficult for a crow to do is to do something completely not crow-like, because they have more instincts. We evolved through neoteny. So we gave premature birth. We gave birth to infants that were underdeveloped, and evolution selected for people who didn't mature completely, who underdeveloped and as adults retained more infantile characteristics into adulthood, like our extreme curiosity and intelligence, our mimesis. But the consequence of doing that, because instincts kick in at different stages in your development, the earlier and earlier we went in our neotenous route through evolution, the fewer and fewer instincts we had left, because we'd reach adulthood and they would never have developed yet. Our distant ancestors would have had those instincts, but we don't. And every time that happened, that was another part of the frame that helped to keep us evolutionarily coherent and sustainable crumbling away. So we got this increased freedom at the cost of this increased danger, that we would do something deeply, deeply stupid and self-destructive. And so as a result, we became more and more dependent upon culture filling in the gaps of all those lost instincts to help to drive us in a sustainable, coherent, healthy direction. So even though I put that evolutionary spin on it compared to what Kenneth says, we more or less agree on this idea that human beings desperately need culture. And as a result, it puts us into a certain existential danger. And the existential danger is if instead of getting a culture, we get an anti-culture, which I'll explicate in a moment, it means that we can be just as confident and determined to do the wrong thing that hurts us as someone who grew up in a healthy culture would be determined to do the right thing that helps everybody. Our need for culture is so driving that we can't distinguish which kind of thing we got. You know, we grow up wherever we grow up, we internalize the things we internalize, and we become like the things that we become. And then we spend the rest of our lives trying to rationalize and justify it and sort of carry out our program, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. And so in the history of the development of culture and the huge diversity across the world that human beings have come up with, some cultures work better for sustainable long-term survival and harmony with the world than others. Some of them are very predatory, very bullying and coercive, very much reducing the world around them to mere resources to be exploited, even other people to just be resources to be exploited. And that what results is an anti-culture. It's a cheap facsimile or knockoff that is inserted into the place of this desperate need we have. It fills the receptor in us for a culture, but instead of getting something that makes us healthy, we get something that makes us sick. And the next thing we know, we have holocausts and gulags and slavery and genocide.
I can see, like, even looking back at a lot of the damage that we've been done, and like a lot of people who are within that culture feel a sense of regret and guilt, even if they aren't directly responsible for it, and then ending up no longer wanting to identify with their country and their culture, and then becoming anti who they are, their own identity. But I'm just thinking about like the implications of that, especially on a wider scale. If the majority of people, say in America, end up having like this self-loathing, self-deprecating opinion when it comes to like their country, like it's not really going to motivate or incentivize people to try to make it better. Instead, it's just going to be like, what's the point? And I don't want to contribute to something that's already like rotten to the core or whatever. And I can see that anti-cultural kind of mentality really infecting the culture even more and causing it to getting closer and closer to its collapse.
Like a feedback loop.
That's one response, Andy, that is open for us, and that is to remove ourselves, to alienate ourselves from the culture. But another is destroy it and rebuild something else, something new, something that we consider better. So we are not locked in. And as far also, Rick, I agree with you about the power of culture on our lives, what we do, what we think. However, we do have some opportunity. We have filters, okay? We are like, there is a part of us that wants the culture, one for memetics. We copy, we are like apes in that way. We like to copy each other, that's how we learn. Another is the warm fuzzy that we get of belonging to a larger entity, the empowerment here. And yeah, that's basically it.
Agency and communion, and we need to figure out how to balance both, like our own sovereignty, but at the same time communion with something bigger than ourselves, which I think are both inherent needs, drives, maybe.
But here are, some filters or some defenses that some filters, I'll call them filters, that some of us can use. And one is to avoid commitment to a certain or attachment to a certain identity, to a certain organization, to kind of keep on the fringes, and to expose ourselves, or to try and find different options, different ideologies, different cultures, so that we have some reference to evaluate each one. So the danger is always there, but we can probably manage some of it, or increase or minimize. One thing for sure, we shouldn't let ourselves just jump in and get devoured, because that's the easiest, the most convenient thing to do.
Yeah. We don't just want to be a symptom of the culture. We want to be able to engage with it dialectically and create some space for choice. You're right. And there's something in us, if we can listen to it, that doesn't want to be just a utensil, that wants to, be
Right.
whole and healthy. And sometimes even if somebody is raised completely indoctrinated in an unhealthy anti-culture, you see sometimes they break away, because what happens is that desire for healthiness and wholeness and to be a good person comes into conflict with the anti-culture that they're part of, and it finally forms an existential crisis where they have an identity crisis. Who am I? What am I doing in this world? And they create this opportunity. It's very painful, but it creates this opportunity for breaking away and making a different choice. As Ayala says, maybe there's another way I could go. Kenneth Smith talks a lot about the importance of existential crisis in helping us to escape the labyrinth that we're trapped in from birth, to be able to realize that we are in a labyrinth and that maybe we need to create more choices for ourselves. And so you'll see him refer a lot to the Archimedean standpoint, that the problem for any system of beliefs that we're currently caught up in is that it's designed to defeat us from being able to realize that it is just a system of beliefs and that there are other ways to look at the world. Part of what makes them what they are is that they try to become entirely self-enclosing, to turn all our logic back into circles so that we can't ever question the system of thinking itself. And that in order to comprehend in its totality one of these systems that has us in its grip, we need, like Archimedes said, if he could find the right standpoint and he had a long enough lever, he said he could move the entire earth. And so when Kenneth is talking about an Archimedean standpoint, he's saying we need a standpoint outside of our programming that lets us see the programming in such a way that it gives us the leverage that's necessary to move it and to create freedom for ourselves, to see more choices. And in order to find those Archimedean standpoints, as a result, Kenneth Smith is a huge advocate of studying as many different perspectives as possible to try to make sure we don't get stuck in one and let it rule us.
That's right. And maybe have a skeptical start to everything. It doesn't mean that you reject everything, every idea that comes your way, but that you start with a question rather than just swallow it like spaghetti. For example, I am against ideology. I don't accept ideologies because, well, it's another discussion, but it's a good start. I can take some ideas from you. Your father must have been a Marxist, right, Rick?
Among many other things that he was at different times.
Okay, but this materialism, this materialistic kind of
that's a classic kind of Leninist Marxism, the focus on the economy to the exclusion of all else.
Yeah. So Marx had some brilliant, wonderful ideas, and I feel that he failed in others or omitted some others. And if we can approach that without committing to some whole ideology, which is so seductive. I mean, we have a lot of seductions in our way of culture.
You know, what was the name again of that humanist Marxist whose name you gave us about a month ago?
Oh,
in the news?
Raya Dunayevskaya.
So I read her work, and you know, she has this critique of 20th century Marxists that they only took the parts that reinforced what they already wanted to believe, but that Marx himself in some of his papers has places where he says, and of course the whole point of dialectics is to turn it on yourself and to criticize yourself, to criticize your party and your group and its methodologies so that you can grow beyond the limitations and not get stuck in an ideology. And then she quotes Lenin, who's reading that exact same work, and when he comes to that final page that tells him to criticize, he says, but there's nothing important after this. And she says, aha, that's our problem in a nutshell. When Marx said, you got to not be so certain of yourself and you have to criticize yourself and you have to grow and change, Lenin said, I don't hear you, la, 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 la.
There it is.
It's almost like we have to ask more fundamental questions like what am I doing this for? And most likely we will come up with some rationalization for that. But it reminds me of the Freudian term reaction formation. You heard of that? So like what happens if someone is abused or traumatized or, you know, just manipulated by somebody? It could be a parental figure or whatever. And if they don't acknowledge or process what has gone on within them, they will be reacting against it for the rest of their lives and without even knowing it. And that will become their identity. It'll become their destiny, basically. And so when you think about it, if you were to ask them, why are you doing this? Why are you so reactive or so anti-authoritarian about whatever? And they might just come up with explanations like, well, I don't like to have, you know, people tell me what to do or whatever. And that might be the surface level, but underneath, like the intensity of that reaction is based on something that has been unexamined. And that's why like the question is like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Well, there are many layers to that. And if we can get to the bottom of that, like the root of that, that's where we can kind of like maybe reorient our behavior towards something that is going to be more sound or more, you know, hopefully productive for ourselves and society. But until we can get to that root, then we're probably going to continue to be reactive rather than proactive, and just following the emotional drive that has been unexamined and repeating ourselves again and again in like an endless loop where history repeats itself because it doesn't know itself, or it claims to know itself, but it never fully learns because it doesn't get to the lower, you know, layer of like truth that is driving it in the first place.
Reaction formation actually is a very good example of American culture and how it affects, how deviating from that will really punish you. Reaction formation is if you don't like something, to exaggerate and express extreme likeness for it. Is the opposite, is to express outwardly in publicly exactly the opposite of how you feel inside, which is a horrible psychological thing to do to a person. It's so self-alienating. But coming, you know, like 49 years ago, I came from Israel and from a culture that was very blunt, straightforward, shooting from the hip. And this was very difficult for me to digest. But I didn't change much. I think I kind of tried to cut, but not too much around the edges. But still, I'm punished for that. People who say how they feel, who are straightforward, are not considered cool. They are considered rude, impolite. And yet, that's the honest way to deal with whatever you have to deal with. So there are, and that's an example of how culture puts a pressure on one to behave in a self-alienating way. I think there are other cultures, not just America. I think the Japanese also don't say the word no, and they kind of go around it. But for example, at work, if the boss will say, you might want to do it this way, using the word might and want, instead of saying do it. You know,
Yes, yes. He wants you to.
Takes a little light off the load.
Go ahead, Christopher.
It just takes a little bit of light off the load if you say things like that.
It's more
If you're
politics.
stern and up front, in our culture in America, it doesn't work. People get taken offensively.
that's right.
So
Yeah,
yes,
I think if
go ahead.
we don't exercise aggression, like authentic aggression, then it just ends up getting transferred into passive aggression. And now everyone is kind of like, the people who have to walk on eggshells are just going to be more passively aggressive. And that's just going to be possibly more annoying than the people who are at least sincere about what they actually feel and just letting it be known. So it's tough because you can't really get rid of it. It's like the law of thermodynamics. Energy can't, be created or destroyed. And when it comes to like these feelings that we have, these emotions, like aggression, it's like we can try to repress them, but they will just come out in a different form. We can't just delete them or erase them from existence.
Right.
And we can see a lot of that happening on a collective level when it comes to the aggression or just the stress and the anxiety and everything playing itself out through politics. It kind of reminds me of like Hegel's Geist, like it's working through us and it's kind of like sweeping us up in like this collective energy that is being either repressed or it's being, completely, wrought forth.
So this is the challenge for us is if we are biologically craving acculturation at the same time that we're craving having an identity of our own and the other things that we have going on. There's some contradictions in there. But if part of what we're craving is acculturation, it makes us vulnerable to manipulation precisely through that angle. And the invention of PR and marketing and spin doctoring, that there's an industry, the manufacture of consent, that was invented in the 20th century. It existed in primitive forms before, but in the 20th century, it was scientized and turned into an industry with massive amounts of funding to manipulate millions of people at a time precisely through, intellectuals express it as, oh, those emotional people are manipulated, but I'm not because I'm an intellectual. But of course, they are manipulated. It's precisely the people who think that they're immune to it who are manipulated the most, because that belief that we're immune from it is the thing that they want above all to have us believe. It's like the moment we think that it's not a con game is when every con artist knows we could be conned. So it's
the
not that it's
Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah, right. So it's not getting at us just through our feelings; it's getting at us through our ideas as well, and the interface between them. It's really the whole desire for culture that has been leashed to a great machine to drive us in the directions that the people who have the power to buy that industry want us to go. And it's a great existential crisis for us because it attacks us at a species level, at something through an avenue that goes well beyond being an Achilles heel. It's not just a vulnerability. It's our entire evolutionary strategy as a species being wielded against us. That's when Kenneth Smith talks about an anti-culture. That's what he means, is that we have perverted the drive for culture in human beings to turn it into something that, instead of bringing them into harmony and sustainability and helping them to become better people, it instead turns them into utensils and tools for maximizing profit, even at the cost of destroying them, destroying the surrounding culture, destroying the ecosystems of the world. Anything's fair game to this kind of nihilist, calculative impulse that has led to using our desperate need for culture against us.
I have a question about this. Maybe I think that there is something I didn't get in the conversation. As you said, Rick, like the human being has evolved in such a way that we need a culture. But for me, like every culture is associated with an ideology, like some values that are more important, like a set of values is always associated with a culture. And so how do we nowadays, when culture are mixed together, there are some tensions. And so how do we solve this? Because it seems like it's just an evolutionary thing. Like if the ideology are not compatible, which is most likely the case between different culture, because the values will be different, then there will be a time where the culture will need to merge together to be uniform. And during this time, there will be some tension because the people will be lost somehow between two ideology. And so how do we solve this? Because on a political level, the people say, oh, you need to be open-minded and so on. And so it seems like counterintuitive. Like I'm not sure if I'm clear, but on one way, it seems to be impossible for the human being to live with different ideology, different culture, and to be in contact with, because he can feel lost inside his brain, inside like how his brain works. And at the same time, like as we promote the culture to mix together, like for economic reasons or else, how do we solve this? Because there are tension worldwide, everywhere, basically, in Europe, in the United States, in Asia, and yeah, how can we solve this?
I think that's a spectacular question, JB. And part of, I don't have a firm answer, but I have sort of some strategies for getting at it that partially come from Kenneth Smith stuff, partly come from other philosophers, partly come from experiences with different cultures. One of the keys is to distinguish an ideology from a culture, and also to distinguish the things we call cultures from things that actually are cultures. So there's a three-way division I kind of want to do, not as absolutes, but as a tool to understanding, just as a model. So one of the things that we have to watch out for is that since we live in an age permeated with advertising, things are almost never called what they really are, especially if they're bad for us. So our colloquial popular usage of the word culture, we're going to be calling all sorts of things cultures that are nothing of the sort. The idea that a culture is actually something objectively real, independent of our definition of it, and that it's necessary to us, and it plays a critical evolutionary role for us, is at odds with the modernist desire to be able to call anything we want whatever we want to call it. And if we want to be able to use the word literally to mean figuratively, and we want to say inflammable, and all these inversions that we do, if we want to be able to call muskmelon cantaloupe, this is a drive in us to erode the distinctions between things in order to facilitate sales and profit. And we've internalized it all. So we have to start by recognizing that we might have to draw a distinction between how we've used these words in the past and how everybody around us is using them and what they might actually mean. The idea that language maybe doesn't only exist in order to serve the fads of the day or the current marketing campaigns, but that it has a purpose that's supposed to help us to highlight the things that are necessary for us, that we have to be able to understand. And that when a language is eroded to the point that it erases those distinctions and begins to break down so that we can't make those critical distinctions, then the language is no longer functioning as a language and has begun to function instead as an object of indoctrination. So I start by saying we got to look carefully at that word culture and distinguish between what kinds of things are cultures, what kinds of things are anti-cultures, and what sorts of things are neither of the two, but we apply the word culture to them whether they are or not. And I don't have a firm answer there, except that if it's not improving our ability to survive and be in harmony over time, then it's not a culture. It's something else that we're calling a culture. It's a substitute, an ersatz culture. There's a, human beings, we judge what's possible for human beings based on a really narrow slice of time. a couple hundred years, a couple thousand years, but people have existed in some form or another for at least hundreds of thousands of years, and possibly up to, you know, 1 million or 2. It depends on how deep into our ancestors what we think of as human psychology goes. And the truth is that we don't know. Right? We all have opinions about Neanderthals and Homo erectus, but the truth is we haven't met one. They're not here for us to interact with. We really don't know for sure what they were like, or when did this craving for culture arise in us, you know? So, but what we do know is no matter where you draw that line, even Homo sapiens sapiens has been around for at least a few 100,000 years. And so if we were trying to understand what's human nature, we would want a sample size that reaches across that whole stretch of time. But instead, all we get is, for most of us, a few decades around our life, and then some caricatures of a few thousand years in the past, and then that's it. That's all we get. So we have to be really humble and cautious about trying to guess what's possible or not possible for human beings, because we're not seeing very much of the total picture. But here's what we can see. What's really clear in the modern era is what an ideology is. Because we're, of all human epochs, we're an epoch that has scientized and industrialized ideologies. We, you know, it's done deliberately and methodically and mathematically at a level of obsession that other epochs weren't capable of, because they were concerned about other things. They had other priorities than we do. Our priority is profiting, right? So we will do anything to get that profit, and we will scientize and tune it up to a level that other people would have said, "What are you, nuts?" And of course the answer is yes, we're nuts, we're moderns. So, you know, I like Kierkegaard here. I think Kierkegaard is helpful, and he can help us to draw the distinction between an ideology and a culture. And it's safe to say, I don't want to oversimplify, that any culture, especially any modern culture, you know, whatever its relationship may be to the cultures that got us through hundreds of thousands of years of survival, whatever it is that we have now that's got some leftovers that justify calling it a culture, is permeated by multiple ideologies, often conflicting and so forth. So JB, I'm with you on that. As we look around ourselves in the world today at our options, they're all riddled with ideologies. But maybe we could say there may have been less of them in the past, because most of the fierce toxified ideologies, extremified ideologies that we see acting in the modern world have very short lifespans. They're like extremely virulent diseases that kill off their population. And so we know that can't have been the norm in the past, or we never would have lasted hundreds of thousands of years. We would have killed ourselves off a very long time ago. So what we're seeing now is not representative of the whole. But here's what we can say. I think Kierkegaard's right on the money. You know it's an ideology if, when you are subject to it, you can't think the ideas that would make it possible to get free of it. What makes an ideology what it is that it's self-enclosing. And so it defeats our ability to think about it. And so if I were to try to draw a distinction between an ideology and a culture, I would say that a culture is the very opposite. So if a culture acculturates you, you learn your myths, you learn your traditions, you learn your habits, you learn your languages and all those things, but you learn to view your own culture and yourself with humility as part of a big, complex world full of mystery and possibilities. If you learn to say, my culture doesn't have all the answers and I should always be searching, if that's what your culture teaches you, then it's more like a culture and less like an ideology. And I can offer one little example of that. And that's, again, from the Dene culture, which is one that I've studied a lot, the Navajo culture. This idea of walking in beauty is based on the idea that we have to pay close attention to nature because it's bigger than we are, and it's older than we are, it's more sustainable than we are, and it's healthier than we are. The Dene perspective believes in good and evil, but not in a Judeo-Christian idea where good is supposed to exterminate and defeat evil, which is a colonizer sort of perspective on the world. But rather, the idea is that the world is made up of all kinds of things, and some of them are healthy in a sustainable way, and some of them are toxic in a sustainable way, but they're okay in small doses. So if you have to get weapons to defend yourself from an incursion, in the Dene culture, you go through a ritual to say, I'm now leaving the beauty way. I'm now going to walk in the enemy way because I recognize I have to do something evil. If we don't do this evil thing, our way of life will cease to exist. So we're going to do this, but this is a terrible thing that we're going to do. And we're sorry that we have to do it. We're going to do it as well as we can. and we're going to end it as quickly as we can. And afterwards, we're going to apologize and make amends as best we can. And we're never going to say that this was a good thing that we did, but it's necessary. So we're going to do it. So when Navajo soldiers come home from war, instead of dumping them out in the streets to be homeless like American culture does, what they do in Dene culture is the whole community gets together and has a ceremony for them. And in the ceremony, they go back through the history of the Dene people and how there were times when people had to walk away from the beauty way and live out of harmony and do something evil in order to protect the survival of the people. But that afterwards, until they made amends, they were sick inside and they couldn't go on with their life. And so you have to acknowledge what you did. You have to acknowledge it was wrong. You have to understand why and how it was wrong. And then you have to re-embrace the beauty way. You turn and you walk away from that life because you recognize that colonizing and conquest and coercion do not lead to a sustainable survival for the world. You can't live in harmony that way. You go back to the beauty way. You go back to the harmony way. If you're not married, they marry you as part of that ceremony. You get a wife. Or if you're a woman, you get a husband. You're brought back into the community and reintegrated, because they recognize that nobody can live like that and that would be sick. We, by contrast, embrace that lifestyle. We follow the Roman example in which there's nothing better than, running around the world and kicking butt and, we're number one. And so as a result, we're massively toxified and we're trapped inside this envelope that won't question itself. You can't even be a Navajo in the traditional sense without questioning yourself. The great joke in Navajo culture is that when you go to grandma and ask her, the directions to the grocery store, she begins with, long ago, when the world was created, changing woman had the following adventure. And it might take an hour, right? Because she wants to make sure you understand the context of what you're doing and that you're part of something bigger than yourself, that you never let yourself get trapped inside of an ideology and think that your ego or your belief system is the truth and you should certainly do it. They always want to put everything back into context to make you question and to think about all the other perspectives. And so if you have Navajo friends and you hang out with them, even when you're asking them straightforward questions like, what would you like for lunch? It's extremely disconcerting for an American because there's this long pause. Because in Navajo culture, they're taught to stop and to reflect and to wonder before they open their mouths. So because I've experienced that, I can see the difference between a culture, what a culture could be like. And I'm not saying that's the only culture or the best culture or anything, but it's a culture for sure, in a way that American anti-culture is not. We're ideological in exactly the same ways where they're cultural. I don't know if that helps. I know that was long-winded, but I didn't know how to show it except through that example.
Actually, one question about what you just said. I liked the way you explained that an ideology was like self-sufficient, like it was like creating loops. But in this case, is any language an ideology? Because when you taught a language, unless you can speak several languages, then you can only think about your language in your own words. So somehow it is part of an ideology. And for instance, I can speak English, French, and German, but I can't speak Chinese. So I can't reflect on all those European language in Chinese. So I'm also part of a European ideology here, because I can't I can see the world how Chinese see it, because I have like a Latin alphabet, and I see the word with subjects, verbs, adjectives, which is not the case in Asia. So I know that I'm part of ideology, and I think it's intrinsically cultural. Like there is like every culture has like intrinsically like an ideology.
Yeah, they certainly have a worldview and a perspective. I agree.
I think it's an opportunity, Christopher. I think you have an advantage. I feel that I speak some other language and like 3 more than English. And it gives me an advantage sometimes as to look at at how the English language, how a sentence, like Rick was talking about the exploitation or the seduction, you could see it in the grammar or in the usage of words, because I might be thinking in another language and it all of a sudden it sounds like, why is this? What is the purpose of it? So that's one thing that would have been nice to bring again the requirement in another language. And most Americans are speak only one language, sometimes two. But can I echo on some of the things you said, Rick? You said a lot of things about culture and first of all, one strategy that I find useful to deal with the seduction of enmeshment into a culture is to, again, not belong emotionally to one or subscribe to one, but to many, to several. And all of us actually have, and the nice thing is that there are different subcultures. Another is to remember, now I belong to an age group, and many people in my age group look down at the younger generation and they said, oh, that sucks, In my time, everything was beautiful and romantic and perfect, right? Kind of natural tendency to remember that, culture changes, and what's important now, how was it not important then? And kind of, again, a reference to evaluate rather than to get locked in familiarity, because we sometimes lock ourselves with what's familiar is what's right. The way we were raised was the right way because we were raised that way. So it's dynamic. Third, culture is more than just a set of ideas and ideologies. It's rituals, it's habits. And those, sometimes if we sort them out, we see what is core and important and what is not. And we know what to throw away, what to keep, and so that we won't be completely shunned out of society, and at the same time we are not devoured by it. But when we are just going after the rituals, and the language changes all the time, the social media, it's a totally different language. And I'm glad I have younger children, they're adults, but they help me keep with the change in culture. And as you see a change, you also have a way to evaluate its validity. As far as ideology, Rick, ideology is, for example, in psychology, that's my field, right? Freud created an ideology. I mean, all of it are models, ideological models. And you realize that they were developed by a person or maybe a group of persons, but usually one person, and their motivation was to make sure they encompass the whole universe in a nutshell. The ego again. So it's important to remember that ideologies are not inductive theories, but they're deductive. They come with a certain agenda or idea, and then pick and choose the data that will support it and validate it. I think all this skeptical approach and comparative approach in temporal, in time, and in space kind of helps.
I got a question. Okay, it's about culture. Um, I'm thinking like in America, for instance, like we attach like a culture to like different races, and I don't think that's necessarily a culture. I mean, like, you know, for instance, African American culture and Caucasian or Hispanic culture in America. I don't really think that's culture. I think it's just, you know, people, you know, coinciding, you know, with each other. And ideology and religion and all of that. I was agnostic, you know, most of my life till a near-death experience. So I'm new to all that. I avoided it all. So I'm learning quite a bit about that. And I understand the concepts, but I mean, I don't understand like having a whole bunch of beliefs and all that stuff. I mean, so I guess I just wanted to throw that thought out there. And then also a question about, is that really culture if by racially profiling? Or, you know, because I mean, I'm learning about cultures, you know, around the world, you know, but I mean, I can see where where some of them are cultures, you know, and it has nothing to do with race or color or creed or anything like that.
Yeah, the U.S. is unusual because its history, its economics are so driven by race in a way that isn't the case for most other places in the world. And I'm not saying no other places are like this. Australia is like this. Brazil is like this. But the U.S. is especially because the dominant culture was made up of colonizers who came and took other people's stuff and then brought a bunch of people from another continent to come here and work it. And so what happened was that for white people, they were able to keep their original cultures more intact. They were able to say, I'm Irish American, I'm German American, they were able to kind of carry over the foods and the traditions and so on. But the indigenous cultures have had to fight like crazy to hang on to their cultures because it was a deliberate, intentional program of the presidents and the various administrations to exterminate indigenous culture, to, what did they say, to drive the Indian out of the Indian and turn him into a white man, because they could see that if they could destroy indigenous culture and force them to live like we lived, that then they would stop resisting us. They would stop, you know, wanting to preserve these alternatives to the way that we live, that we didn't want to exist at all. You know, we wanted to wipe them out. And likewise for African Americans, the challenge there is that we ripped people out of their homes and subjected them to incredible brutality. And demanded that they go to church and demanded that they behave in the ways we expected them to behave. And we were in a position to punish them if they didn't do that. And so as a result, it was extraordinarily difficult for Black Americans to keep track of, you know, was I from Ghana originally? Was I from Zimbabwe? Who were my people? What cultural traditions am I trying to keep alive? And so as a result, they got kind of a melting pot. Black Americans kind of developed these different regional melting pots that were because you threw together all these people from different places in Africa that had nothing to do with each other. And somehow they had to come up with a way to survive and take care of each other and eat and do the things that needed to be doing. So as a result, Black America is certainly not one monolithic culture, but it has cultures to a greater extent as a whole than just about anybody else, because everybody else got to keep some part of where they came from. And it's why, for example, in the science fiction community, when people talk about Afrofuturism, there's a big debate about, do African Americans get to say that they're part of the Afrofuturist movement, or do only Africans get to say they're part of the Afrofuturist movement? Because African American culture is very different from the many different cultures of Africa, each of which is far more distinctive because they didn't have it beaten out of them and you know, punished out of them. So, you know, the short answer to your question is it's complicated. Is it really depends on which part of America you're from, where your ancestors came from, how much you preserved from what was there. But what we can say about it is that even if you were white, even though white America isn't a thing in quite the same way, because people were like, well, I'm German American or I'm British American or what have you. Nevertheless, the specific flavor of anti-culture that America has, because it's based on colonization, genocide, and slavery, turns it into sort of an acid that eats away at other cultures and tries to turn them into itself. When we talk about a melting pot, we think of that as a good thing. and a healthy thing that results in something nutritious, but it's actually carried out in a caustic way, such that like we mock the French for protecting their language. Right? We're like, well, why don't you just give up and speak English like we're trying to make you do? Like some part of us admits that we're trying to coerce the whole world into eliminating all their languages and all their choices and to only be us when we do that. And so what it means is that if you're at the far corners of the earth, as though the earth has corners, from the United States, you have a better chance of preserving whatever your indigenous traditional cultures are than if you're living right here in the middle of it, where it's constantly working at you with every radio broadcast, every newspaper article. It's constantly over and over reimposing this idea that you shouldn't be different, you should all blend in, you shouldn't try to maintain any sort of separation from the larger culture, just give up. We have a very Borg-like thing going on here, start from Star Trek references, So the short answer is it's very complicated, but the question you're asking is exactly the right question. It's like the pivotal problem for people in America or exposed to American culture is what the hell's going on here? It's
Right.
very involved. It's full of power and force. What's happening? It's central to our lives, but it's so complicated. It's hard to sum up.
Isn't the melting pot just another way to deal with our failure at pluralism?
Yes.
And again, it's a kind of colonizing. It ended up as colonizing.
Yeah.
But another question, culture. I found Christopher's question real challenging. Don't we sometimes replace community and culture with category? Categories, LGBT, right? How we call the LGBT we refer to them as a community, but they are a category.
I don't feel like, I feel like they're a community because they made themselves a community, but that's just a part of sexuality. That's a completely different category, but yet they had to rise because, they were, a lot smaller. I mean, there was a lot more people were against same sex than were not. Now it's, kind of drastically changed. And now I feel like they look kind of, dumb to have, the LGBT community, because it's like, well, it's over with, I feel like they got their rights, they won, or whatever you want to call it. But I agree with you.
It's certainly a thing that marginalized people do. I think you're right that they end up, under the pressure of this kind of acidic, toxic anti-culture, they end up having to together invent something to make up the difference. Whether it's a category, whether it's a sort of a novo culture, something that they start coining phrases. They start, coming up with patterns and rhythms in their lives that they agree to do. You can see it in the way that the scattered remnants of the various African cultures, when subjected to slavery, had to invent culture here that would be their culture together in a way that, back where they came from, they would have had separate cultures. But people can't live without a culture. So they even though their masters wanted them to give in and just make themselves as white as they could be, they could see that wasn't going to work for them. That was just not a healthy way to be. And they didn't want to erase themselves and make themselves into mirror images of the people who were oppressing them. And so as an act of rebellion, they engaged in culture formation, deliberate culture formation, and trying to create, what would it be to be a black slave who yearned to be free? What was he going to eat? How was he going to talk? They had to invent all that and come up with it and try to make it healthy in a way that their tormentors, had no interest in making it for them. What I'm struck by about this discussion is, I don't know if most people realize that in classical Greece, the Olympian religion, the Greek gods that they worshipped, was artificial. They invented that on purpose as an act of culture making. And they did it after the Trojan War, because the Trojan War led to this kind of region-wide collapse in all the civilizations. It wasn't just Troy that fell. Mycenae ended up falling. Everything fell. And they went into a dark age where previously there had been a high rate of literacy. Suddenly, most people couldn't read. The commerce and trade and communication across areas was decreased. It was a massive collapse in the level of civilization that they had. And the Homeric project wasn't just about some blind guy named Homer who made up a bunch of cool stories. It was to say, dear God, what have we done to ourselves? How did we go so wrong that we had this amazing civilization and now we're sitting here sick and poor and impoverished and hungry and not able to read and write? How do we reverse this? And so they did an analysis of what led to the Trojan War and decided to make a national epic for a new culture that they would forge out of the various broken pieces of the culture that had existed before. So they went among all the different tribal deities and they selected the ones that they thought together could help to paint a picture of a people that could work together and not fight against each other. That's why Zeus says that being a good host is one of your top commandments. You have to treat people well. When people come down the road and they come and stay with you, you can't kill them and eat them. That's not okay. No cannibalism, right? It's like they told stories about monsters who ate people specifically to stop that practice that broke out during the Dark Ages. They had deities who you admired who were into reading and writing and craftsmanship and civilization to again hold up the idea that that was better than living in horrible ways that they were living. They put all this stuff together and they deliberately crafted the Olympian religion out of the pieces they had. They crafted the Olympic Games. Nietzsche writes about this, by the way. It's fascinating. It's called Homer's Contest. He wrote an essay. They crafted the Olympic Games because they figured out that the Greeks couldn't stop fighting. There's for whatever reason, whether it's cultural or biological, the Greeks just couldn't stop themselves from tearing themselves apart. And so they said, what if instead of fighting, we competed? What if we could say, instead of hitting each other with swords, we'd say who could throw this discus the farthest, or who could compose the greatest tragic play, and so on. So they invented these games so that everybody who was just desperate to kill each other would instead channel all of that rage and desire to kill into instead crafting arts and doing these amazing works together. And that was why it was a sacred time when even if you had a war, when it was time for the Olympian Games, the gods themselves commanded you to stop the war and to send your representatives to the games and to compete. And a significant number of Greek wars stopped that way and never restarted. Over and over, every few years, there was an interruption to the strife. And gradually, over time, they settled down into a pattern where civil wars for a few centuries became the exception rather than the rule. So what they did, trying to save themselves after a dark age, is very much like what African Americans did trying to create a culture for themselves after the trauma and Holocaust of slavery, or what Israel did in response to anti-Semitism, because Hebrew was almost a dead language by when it was picked up and revitalized and rejuvenated to create a national identity. And again, it's like what LGBTQ people did. It's like being killed, being abused, being battered. They said, okay, fine, let's try to create a culture out of this to help ourselves come together and survive under this kind of duress. So what's interesting about this is that it fits in with this notion that human beings desperately crave culture, but it also shows that cultures can be deliberately cultivated. They don't just have to be a result of thousands of years of traditional indigenous kind of evolution, shall we say.
Right.
It's just
the identity. I think culture and identity are very highly correlated.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. This has definitely got me totally culture stricken. Like I don't even really feel like I identify with any culture other than cultures I'm learning about now. I mean, I grew up in America. I was raised, in a Christian home, but as soon as I saw what Christianity was at an early age, I just went agnostic. So, I mean, that's like all I know. I don't even know where my family came from. The last 150 years, it was from Atlanta. I don't know anything from there. And I mean, I grew up in Atlanta. That's it. So, I mean, like, I feel like I'm culturalist. I do identify as pansexual. But that's an identity. And I don't really feel like the LGBT community is quite a culture. I do agree with what you said.
So what does it say on your shirt? Harley or Hurley?
Hurley. It's like Abercrombie or something.
My background's a lot like yours. My family on both sides, people were cut off from the rest of their families. went off by themselves, started a family, didn't tell their descendants where they came from or what their traditions had been. And so I get this from multiple sides, and they all married into each other. And as a result, basically I'm a mutt, and not just racially, but culturally especially. And the particular kind of mutt that I am is the same kind that you are, where I don't really have a culture. You can't say that America likes to say that it is a culture and it has a culture, but when you compare it to actual living cultures, it is clear that it's an anti-culture, and that what we've got inside us is this sort of aching void. And that's cultivated on purpose to make us hungry to buy things. This
Very
movie
good.
will give you culture. This
It's
we're,
culture in the same sense that McDonald's is food.
yes, fast culture instead of fast food. So I'm with you, Christopher. I feel that right in my bones, what you're talking about.
Right.
Me
One
too.
thing I found myself, because I have chronic illness, is like you watch a lot of those movies, how so many of the younger people, especially, or people my age, I'm 45, like where they hang out kind of has so much to do with their culture, their identity, where they go, who they are. So I always I get really nervous when I think of like making friends and hanging out or dating, because it'd be like, well, take me where you usually go. Where you hang out, take me to your place, your spot. Well, the only place I can take him is Scott and White. It's like, this is literally where I am most of the time, So it's like, it's definitely one thing that's also when you're kind of in the chronically ill culture, whatever you want to call it, it's very hard to find your place, to find like-minded people or to involve somebody in it without looking like a total weirdo.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And part of what if I had not actually directly witnessed and interacted with people who have culture, I mean real culture, I might have thought this was normal. I mean, I might have thought it was unsatisfying. We can all feel the ache, but I would have thought it was like that this is just the human condition to have this ache. But I for a while every year I would go in May out to the Navajo reservation, to the same place with the same people, and hang out with them for a week. And we would go hiking and we'd be camping, and around the campfire they would tell us stories about their people and their history and their beliefs. And what I could see is that first of all, nobody would say that having Navajo culture makes you immune to pain and agony and all kinds of these other things, considering the things they've gone through, which have just been horrendous. There's no question. But they know who they are. And they are where they're supposed to be. I mean, that land and them as individuals and their culture and their cosmology, all the stories about the origins of the Navajo people, changing women, all of it is about that particular place and why they're there. The mountains at the borders are sacred to them because each of them was a major site of one of the great mythological events that happened in them becoming a people. And I say mythological, but I don't mean it in the sense of being false. Right. It could literally have happened just the way they said. We keep finding indigenous stories that are eventually, after decades of being disputed, borne out by later archaeological discoveries. Like when we thought everybody came across the Bering Land Bridge just a little while ago, and the Native Americans were like, oh no, that's not what happened. And we're like, how would you know? We have science and we're advanced and you're a bunch of savages. But then now we have found, remains that are not just a little older, but 5,000, 10,000 years older than when the land bridge opened up. It's like, it's impossible that those people at those sites could have come through when we said that they did. And the Navajos and other folks were right, that they had been there longer than we thought they were. So how do I know that these 4 sacred mountains at the borders of the Navajo lands were not, in fact, the locations of some, in the distant past, some great cultural breakthrough where they realized from now on, we need to treat each other this way, because if we don't, it'll be like the story that has just ended. We don't want to be like that anymore. So what I mean to say is, like, their life makes sense. Yeah. Like everywhere that they look around them, the shape of their house, the hogan, the traditional house, corresponds to the 4 directions, which correspond to the 4 mountains, which correspond to 4 stages of their life from birth to death, which correspond to the 4 worlds, the emergence of the Navajo people as a people, and what they learned at each stage of cultural evolution, which corresponds to what you learn at each stage of life and the things you're supposed to do as a parent or as someone who's learning to walk or what have you. It's like it's coherent. Like they have had a long time to pull it together and explain, why are we here? How are we supposed to treat each other, and why this place? But I don't know where my people came from, other than that I'm some kind of European mutt. Whatever their purpose might have been, by the time it got to recent generations, it was alcoholism and mental illness and homelessness and broken families and abusiveness. And, where we find ourselves is like having to begin to answer these really simple but important questions that we don't have answers to, but that we feel the need for answers to, but that people from indigenous cultures that are traditional, they've got all those answers. Whatever their problems, and they have plenty, they know the answers to those questions and we don't.
Yes and no, they struggle. I live now
yeah.
in Navajo country, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we have a huge Navajo reservation, the size bigger than the size of Indiana.
Right.
And I come, and there is an anthropologist at that local university that is part of their family. They adopted her, so I go with her a lot, and I'm very impressed with what you pointed out, and that they have a kind of wisdom that is beyond the Western culture, also in dealing with struggle and with pain and with revenge, that we don't. However, they struggle now because they were colonized, they are confined, and like with the pandemic, they got the pandemic from being in contact with the outside world, with us, so-called off-white people, and yet they don't have the means to deal with it. So many of the homes don't have water or electricity. So how do you wash your hands, which is the first thing we are said to watch, without having water in your house? As a result, they lose a lot of their elders, because those are the high risk, and there is a very high rate of death among the elders.
Yeah.
And they lose the tradition, and it's a huge loss. Now,
it's a catastrophe.
It is. It's a calamity. And but before the pandemic, when I attended some of the parties and the holidays they have also a collective ego type. They transcend their Western individual ego into the good of the community. And so there is a lot of order and compliance, but it's not that kind of compliance that we have with the struggle. It's with a very deep understanding of wisdom that keep them going. It's amazing. On the other hand, us, as some of us, Adam, you mentioned lately, we have to really be immune, at least to some parts of the culture, not completely. We have to deal with being alone in the world, standing alone. To some degree, I mean, you can have a family, you can have friends, but it's not the same thing. And that requires self-confidence, strength, some other commitment. Yeah, it's difficult. It's an existential issue of hanging on to that and not moving because you're afraid. So people who are high on anxiety are not likely to detach from herd mentality, from the culture.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something. What you said, it made me think of something. You said you went to the indigenous people, every year or so. Well, I got to thinking about I grew up in Atlanta, which is considered the melting pot of the South or whatever, like you said, the melting pot, you brought that up. But I noticed that I didn't really have a culture growing up. So yet I hung around every race but white. I hung around Hispanics, and I gravitated toward other people other than Caucasians, because I felt like they all had something I didn't have. Just like you had said, the African Americans, they do have a form of culture because they were brought over here for slavery and taken away from their culture. They had to create one here. And I feel like that's kind of what I did, was dance around because I felt everybody else's culture. And then instead of, I guess, like obtaining what their culture and, feeling, like I had something, I was forced into all my answers by a near-death experience. And then you said something about alcoholism. Yeah, I battled that all my life, till just recently. But I think it's a label. I really do. I think the problem lies way past the cognitive, behavioral problem you have with continually using.
Did you see the recent study? It was just in the last couple of years, and I think it was with rats, where there was a follow-up to an earlier study. It was looking at the whole, was it cocaine-laced water, and would rats go for it? And what they found was that rats in isolation or miserable conditions would go for the drugs. But rats that had a lot of enrichment activities and were surrounded by other rats they could cuddle with and groom and interact with and who would take care of them, given the choice between the drug-laced water and the pure water, they always went for the pure water. Because it turns out we talk about addiction being a disease, but we don't talk about the fact that part of what the disease is not personal. Part of what the disease is anti-cultural. If we lack the support that culture gives us, then we struggle lifelong at a really deep level to try to fill that void, and we can't stop. It's just it's in us. This is how we evolved. But if we're surrounded by the kinds of things that a healthy culture does and has, then our need for those things goes away on its own. And so it raises the question, we've had this model for decades that it's a personal disease, right? Which granted is an improvement over calling it a personal failing, right? That, oh, you're just weak and you do this thing. Saying that it's a disease recognizes at least the fact that it seems to be transmitted and that has all these other characteristics. But this new model appears to give us an even deeper insight, which is that the disease appears to evaporate the moment that the culture around us gets rich enough and rewarding enough that we're getting what we need from it.
I agree with that. But I definitely disagree with it being a disease. I think that there's underlying issues that you created by your cognitive behavioral disorder. You can call it that. By continually using, you created a mental illness. You created yourself to be alienated from your culture, your people, because nobody wants to be around an addict or a drunk, that's, abusing them. And so I feel like there's underlying conditions that once you get past that stage, which, trust me, it was hell, to not use every day.
Yeah.
It does. It evaporates, because then you're kind of forced into resolving the issues that you created off of your stupidity of using, on a regular basis.
That feedback loop, the negative feedback loop.
I agree.
I agree, Christopher. I agree, except the word stupidity. It has nothing to do with intelligence. And
you're right.
And sometimes not even with choice. The power of we can't undermine the power of circumstances and chance in our life. There is randomness, and not everybody is responsible and controls their life. It just doesn't happen. And you are right about the danger of the label that you get and call it pathology. I just read about Foucault, and Foucault, when was diagnosed as gay when he was homosexual at that time, diagnosed as a pathological, was in the DSM at age 14. And from there, I mean, the amount of suffering, and it's good that he was able to learn to transcend from it. But everything, all those diagnoses in the manual are all relative to the culture, the dominant culture today, and especially to politics.
Right.
Especially to politics.
I'd like to say something definitely about the labels on like sexuality, because I labeled myself because I don't know, it gave me some form of relief, because I was labeled bisexual, but I didn't feel bisexual, because that meant to me 50-50. That meant I'm attracted to men and women. And that's not the case. The case is I have the ability to be intimate with anybody that I'm attracted to. That doesn't mean I'm attracted more to I've got a percentage. It's not 50-50. I'm attracted more to femininity. So therefore, if a man is got more, is androgynous and has more, feminine characteristics, then I have the capacity to be intimate with that person. But yeah, so I felt a lot of relief from a label that I totally disagree with labeling people in the first place. I don't even really agree with male and female other than sex, other than organs,
Yeah. Pathologizing.
What I think you're talking about identity, and identity relieves a lot. Yeah, but the pathological label, making it pathological, that's what I was talking about.
Yes, ma'am.
And with alcoholism today, the secular approach is not to call it not to see it as a disease, but to look at what Rick was talking about, is what is it replacing? What is it doing for you, or at least in the beginning? And the more important question, how to replace it? How to give one the feelings or the needs that they miss so much to fall into it, and replace it first. So that's called the SOS, the secular approach to replace AA. Yeah,
I feel that the label disease was just put because of medical failure. They had no way of treating it medically. So they just gave up. We'll just call it a disease, and we'll give them this 12-step program, which I do on a daily basis without even knowing. You have to teach that to somebody, but because of the way they've been living and abusing drugs and alcohol, it's just a way of living the 12 steps. That's what you should do as a human being, in my opinion. And that's why I don't go to meetings and I stay sober, because I just feel like, number one, I don't have a disease. Number two, I definitely don't, feel the need to follow a 12-step program, because I follow a self-actualization path. And that is the same thing, basically. So with what you said, finding a replacement, that is the ultimate replacement, is seeking from within yourself.
You were putting in a missing piece of culture with the 12-step program that became a part of your life. You replaced some of the anti-culture aimlessness that was right where you needed something with a culture fragment that helped you to structure your life in such a way that you didn't need the alcohol anymore. It's fascinating, because on the Navajo reservation, one of the things, and again, I'm not holding them up as an ideal that we should all follow. It's an example of an actual culture that in a life where I don't usually get to see one, So they have huge problems with alcoholism, as is well known. Native Americans didn't have the deep immersion in alcohol that we've had for thousands of years in Europe, and so as a result, they didn't have the cultural or biological resistance to it. So, but one of the treatments that's proven very effective on the Navajo reservation, which is shocking. There's in addition to having the traditional Navajo religion or way of life, they also have the Native American church with the peyote, where it's part of a religious ritual. that they go through. Just like all the other ceremonials, the Navajo have adapted the Native American church ceremonial with the peyote into another ceremonial, like the ant way or the deer way or the enemy way or the all the others. And the family that I stay with, they have gone through that alcoholism at really serious, crippling levels. The guy who's the main one who hosts us, who is very dear to me, revealed to me last time that he had been a completely out of control alcoholic. His life was a complete mess. And he went through the ritual and started doing the ceremonies, and they filled in that missing culture for him. And they broke him out of the ruts he was in his mind and allowed him to back off and look at his life fresh for the first time, in decades. And once the alcohol was out of the way, he was able to do like you did and start putting in place these other parts of his life, these other fragments of culture to cobble together a more complete culture. And he's never gone back since. And after he had that experience, he then started going around to his different family members who were still stuck in the bottle and took them through the process too. And they came out of it and never went back. It's like his whole family, not everybody, but most of his family are now alcohol free and drug free, and they're trying to take care of each other and live their lives, and part of it is because they've replaced this void that they were filling with the drug. They've replaced it with actual culture where they take care of each other and they think about each other and they think about themselves and take care of themselves. So it really underscores that there is this need we have, and that if we don't meet the need, it damages us pretty badly.
Well, I about 4 years ago, I overdosed on heroin, and that started my not having a choice. Like my consciousness was raised, my vibration state was higher. I had, major morality changes. And so the process started itself without me even wanting it to. And then it took me a while to even figure it out. But over the last 4 years, I have drank several times, more than several, but I've never felt the need to continue the cognitive behavioral problem with it, because I had something, that I did replace it with.
Right.
Even though I didn't have a choice, I didn't know what happened to me.
Yeah, Kenneth Smith himself came out of a family that had struggled with alcoholism. His dad, he's talked about that. And he got himself to the point where you're at. As an adult, Kenneth can, he can take a drink, and he doesn't feel that need to then follow it up with drinks for the rest of his life, the way that like my mom did. He's able to have a sort of a free will relationship with it and make it a part of a larger culture instead of a replacement for one.
I find it, one question I get a lot from my Facebook friends and stuff is, because I think people who don't have chronic illness tend to only see like one side of it. They see the suffering.
Absolutely.
And so like, I have so many people say like, how can you always be so positive? Like, like they see so many people that are so positive. It's like, well, for starters, the worst part of anything is anticipation. And when you're right in the middle of it, the familiarization becomes very comforting.
Yes.
It's like anything in life you do, if that's what you're doing all the time, it's what you're doing.
Yes.
And so it's like, and also when you don't have, like I say, they see this one present, like the suffering, and I think it becomes so elongated, stretched out. They think that's the only thing. It's like we're born with it, we're going to die that way, And the way we see it is more, we're getting closer to the end. We see it more fluid and dynamic. And so it's like, it's kind of funny because I like to think of like a first timer, because I can't remember the first time I went to Scott and White and went to the main desk for like surgery, MRI or CAT scan or whatever. And I can relate to it the way I am now, where it's almost like the movie cliche. Well, I come in and like finish our sentences for them. I'll be like, yep, go over there. I got it. It's almost like they don't even get a chance to speak. And so it's like, it's so secondhand now, and that's one thing I was going to answer also to you. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Is Ayala? Okay. So one thing I was going to say back to the friends dating thing, kind of related, is you definitely go through sort of cycles. Like the first thought you have is, am I going to live? Then you kind of go through this, oh, am I going to get better? Then you go through this, how long is it going to take? And so now I'm at the point where it's like, I'm pretty much at the better part. And I've been talking with a therapist on like getting integrated back into society. Well, of course, right when we got to the point she was like getting me out of the apartment, the pandemic hits. And so now we're kind of like in this weird thing of like, we meet every week, like we don't know what to do, you know? And it's like the longer that goes on, the kind of more drawn out and kind of whatever these thoughts. So it's kind of like the other way around. The thoughts that are maybe dire for most people, those are the ones that I'm seeing like the way they, you know, opposite of the way they would be. So for me, it's like the everyday little thoughts are kind of like, you know, whereas like, you know, for them, it's just, you know, it is what it is. And it's like the worse the pandemic draws out, I think the worse it gets. And I also have Asperger's. So I have problems with depression, anxiety, and depersonalization, derealization. And I'm finding that those are getting steadily worse, you know, week by week by week. Because it's like, when I thought of life as like having a life, I definitely didn't picture this.
Pandemic's putting everybody under some pretty extreme pressure in America.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think about places like New Zealand or Jordan where they just did what it took to bring it to a stop right away and get back to life. And yeah, it's going to from time to time break through and they'll have to do it again, but they get to basically be a country because they did what it took, whereas we were in denial. And so now we don't get to be a country and we're just under this endless first wave of cases. And what it's doing is everything that was hard, that was difficult or was fragile and brittle and not healthy enough, it's that, but that somehow could just barely skate by under normal conditions. Now those things are all sort of breaking in quick succession. And we're being faced with a series of crises that we've been postponing.
I want to throw something out there, a little off subject, but you know, I concluded a lot of things out of my near-death experience. But the one thing that I did conclude was, and I've tested this out, and I found out this might be a better place to do it, but I tested it out with certain people, a couple people, and it did not settle well. And I think it has to do with culture, and it has to do with, you know, America and everything, and religion. Is I come to the realization that I am God. And for some reason, that doesn't resonate very well with the majority of people that hold on to some form of ideologies or religions, because they have separateness and they have duality thoughts. And, you know, everybody has dualism in some form or fashion, but the thought of I'm separate from somebody else or I'm separate from God just didn't exist for me anymore. And you know, I said it on Facebook, lost 400 friends, you know, that back to the social network, you know, I mean, I lost, you know, half my friends, you know, because people thought it was a ego-based, you know, statement.
You're trying to say the opposite of ego.
Yeah, I was like, I feel oneness. I feel interconnected with the universe. I feel that I'm no different than anybody else. And I feel that I am God. I'm interconnected through unified consciousness. And people just are not ready for that, the people I run into.
Yeah, well, it's that whole thing of those words are too loaded for them. They can't hear it the way that you mean it. They can only hear it the way that they mean it. And so you can say it as much as you want, and they're still going to hear a different message. And the message they hear, you know, is horrifying to them, even though what you're trying to say is something more wholesome.
That's exactly what I experienced. Was people got pissed off. They disliked, they thought I was ego-based with my statement. They didn't understand. It screwed with their belief systems, you know, and then it turned into like, you know, I don't want that guy around. But then again, you know, end result, everybody that, you know, migrated out of my life, whether I pushed them out from alcoholism or not, the people left for a reason. I'm trying to, you know, find my people, you know, and kind of put my, you know, this is 4 years after alcoholism. I'm still putting the pieces together.
Right. Yeah. That idea that, how do I put it? So one of the things that we inherited as a modernist epoch arising out of the medieval epoch is the idea that life is one thing and religion is something else, that the sacred and the mundane are two different things and that they're separated from each other. In fact, there has to be a chasmic, abysmic, infinite separation between them. All the meaning is over here, and everything that we experience as real life is supposed to be meaningless and nothing except unless meaning descends upon it from beyond. And once you accept that perspective, the statement "I am God" is inconceivable, right? Because they can see you, so they've all got you sorted into the meaningless category of the stuff of life that doesn't mean anything without this external blessing. And so they're trapped within that framework. And where this came up, again, talking about the Dene, that was interesting to me is that when Christians first came and encountered the Navajo, they thought they were all atheists because they didn't have any churches and they didn't have some special one day set aside to go be decent human beings. And so they said, well, then these people must be heathens and they work for the devil and we have to convert them all. What they didn't understand is that from the Navajo perspective, it was the Europeans who didn't have any religion, because the Europeans acted horrifically towards each other and everybody else, 6 days of the week and most of Sunday, but would set aside just a couple of hours to say, okay, for this little time, we're going to contemplate the idea that things might be sacred and important, and maybe we should behave like decent human beings. So what the Europeans were missing when they encountered the Navajo is that for the Navajo, everything was sacred. Their house was sacred. The land was sacred. Their moccasins were sacred. Like, that's why they paused before answering questions, because, for them, it's a sacred thing, and you have to be respectful and careful about what you say and how you act, that at all times you're in church. And it took something like a century before white Americans could recognize that the Navajo actually had a religion. It's just that it wasn't a separate part of their way of life. Their whole culture was a religion. So when you say I am God, I get where you're coming from in a way, because I've been exposed to that Navajo idea.
Right. I mean, I feel like, that now the culture, the word culture, the definite, I think it's resonating with me now because I'm applying it to, I need to find people of like minds. You know what I'm saying? Because I mean, I really do feel alien to the planet. I mean, there's all kinds, and I just don't resonate with other people because, they don't, I'm just not on the same page as people for some reason.
It's the existential condition of people living inside of an anti-culture, is that we feel disconnected from each other. We feel disconnected from the world. We feel disconnected from ourselves, and we're kept there in order to maximize our appetites to buy things and to linger.
As Western people, that's right. But Christopher, with this social distancing, it has changed. The pandemic has changed the culture, and it's very doubtful that we will go back to what it used to be. So, as hard and depressing it might be, it's also an opportunity to recreate maybe a new culture and to adapt. So we have to be creative now and pull all our adaptive strengths as to find different ways to connect to people. And I love the internet. I mean, this, for example, take what we are doing now, Meetup. I would have never met you guys.
Mm-hmm.
We don't live, I don't know where you live. You live in the East Coast, right?
Nashville.
Okay, and one in Atlanta.
And I'm in Austin.
Yeah, and I'm in New Mexico. So those face-to-face meetups were nice face-to-face, but they are limiting. They're limited to the local. So I was not just able now to connect to you as humans, as other people, and hear about your experiences and feelings, and you hear about mine, but also to be introduced to new ideas, to different ways to different perspective, to old ideas. It's a wonderful opportunity now.
I think the social networks, and before I started to do a lot of self-work, self-reflection, I saw the social networks. I saw Facebook as just the whole unity. There's more to social networks. This is one, but I saw the bad in Facebook, like the horrific, like it was the playground for the introverts, it was the playground for the psychological disorder people. I mean, I just saw it as all the bad things. But when I started to do more self work on myself and open up and do those things, now I see all the good in social network, and I kind of just dismiss all the bad because I really was caught up on the bad for quite some time.
Right.
But I like what you said. This right here is a social network, and I wouldn't have this opportunity. If it wasn't for Meetup, I wouldn't have this opportunity at all, because I've been searching for people just to even have a conversation with.
There you go.
There's a really good author named Albert Memmi, and he wrote this book, The Colonized and the Colonizer. And one of my favorite quotes from that is, so I think he was a Jewish Algerian, and he said, because I didn't fit in with anybody, I understood everybody. And it sort of brings in sort of the idea of, like, as we're trying to critique ideologies and sort of separate ideologies from cultures, at the same time steer society to becoming a quote unquote better culture, or like something that we're completely, like, we see the parts of our culture that are just not working. We see the parts that have just been taken over by institutions and systems that are trying to just perpetuate just the husk making of us poor, dear horde called humanity. As somebody who can step outside of culture, or somebody who is in a sense forced outside of culture, and say personally, I sort of experienced this as an adoptee from Eastern Africa, Mozambique, living in Portland, Oregon now. It's pretty wild. And like, I'm trying to look around for a group. As somebody who is in a sense constantly and continually on the periphery, doesn't that enable them to, I should say, by right or by wrong, or for better or for worse, it enables them to really be the ones who can stir up change. And in a sense, because we're never really going to get sucked into the mass of fashionistas, we can sort of continuously, as much of a struggle as it is, because my God, it is a struggle. It, like we were talking, existential crisis is like all day, every day in a sense. But at the same time, there's so much beauty in that. And in a sense, what Ayala was saying, we could use that, the chaos to create that creativity, to really look and identify at all cultures. But I also wonder too, like, at what point does culture become too comfortable? Say, like, if you give the rats enough companions and they like no longer care to drink the drug-laced water, at what point does that culture just devolve, in which you have to like give them, almost like you were saying about the Navajo, you have to give the drug-laced water and just entice a couple rats to drink it, so they may see, or they may reflect on something that they're missing. Because I don't know, I can think of off the bat, but there are probably some cultures that just devolve or just disintegrate because things were too nice. And I'm sort of like looking at sort of American culture and how it is now compared to what it was in, say, like post World War II, when for the majority of the population it was too nice. And of course, minorities, we even say even women weren't really treated well at all. But like we would say for majority white, it was quite nice, and people had houses, people had jobs, and then there's always this, hence the great push to go back there by a large portion of our populations today. So how do we make sure the culture doesn't get too comfortable, in which it gets complacent and then erodes into just this barbaric state? Even though like the point is to create a comfortable, like, I don't know, culture to be in. And in a sense, like, how do we walk that fine line between that?
Yeah, those are some wonderful ideas, perspectives that you brought, Dowdy. And the last one, how do we keep a balance between well-being and comfort and harmony, and not getting rusty and decay and regressed? And so to allow social change, to allow conflict, conflict and trauma have a job too. So now we are going through a trauma, and it's we all could do without it with the pandemic. And by the way, the pandemic is not the only one. The extinction which we forgot about. The sixth extinction, which we are in, is even a bigger one challenge. But that's a challenge that opens so many. I was hoping, when we try not to get to politics, but I can't avoid it, when Bernie and AOC came with some radical systemic changes, not just party to party, that we will jump on the opportunity to really start a radical change. But I guess not everybody was ready. People were still too dormant. So I don't know how to get there, Dowdy. Maybe in the next generation, if it survives. But what you brought from me, the idea of not belonging but being everywhere, or empathizing with, understanding everybody, is exactly right. And that's why when people ask me, are you Israeli, are you American, what's your nationality, I say I'm planetarian, because I refuse to, right. And my son is with the queer, is queer, and a queer filmmaker and a queer cultural leader. And I find that I like their philosophy, and look what their queer philosophy brought too. They felt like outsiders, and they decided, unlike the LGBT category, to maintain their outside status. They are not trying to get the same. Yeah, they are for equal rights, but they don't want to get into the institutionalized America. They don't want to be swallowed by the mainstream. So that you're right, they had this opportunity, which many of them take as a community or what, and that's tolerance, total tolerance. Not just of gender and sexual orientation and sexual identity, but also race, religion. And when I look, my son lives in Germany. I mean, the community that he's in is so diverse, it's so wonderful. But the reason they were able to get that is to liberate themselves from the attachment to those artificial categories that we call race, gender, and whatever.
I really like the quote you said. I think it was, I feel so different, from everybody else, but yet I understand everybody. And I feel like that kind of applies to what I'm going through, because what I don't understand is why people don't feel the way I feel. I don't want nobody to believe what I believe. I'm not trying to change people. So, but yet it's given me the opportunity, because I didn't have beliefs. I didn't have anything. I was agnostic. And now it's given me the opportunity. Yes, nobody feels what I feel, but I'm able to accept others, and I guess I feel like I know other people better now, because I know myself, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I really do like that quote.
Yeah, there's definitely a bunch of introspection that necessarily has to go on if one finds themselves or oneself isolated. It's really interesting too, sort of going back to Black America, and sort of like, and here I speak about all the Americas, because we have such a problem in the United States when we say America. Well, there's two continents here, man.
Yeah.
But really, what we were saying earlier about sort of the need to create culture really brought into my mind the idea of voodism, and especially in the Caribbean, how especially demographic wise, there's just like they had really the only hope they really had of like mental sustenance, like mental stability, was to create a culture. But specifically in the United States, it's something that's always interested me, because it does seem like in one instance, Black culture is in a sense a perfect representation of white culture. I would always imagine if you sort of switch the skin tone, the same thing would be created had like the histories continued to run in a sense parallel. like it does take on so much of white American culture, except maybe more impoverished. And there's like a really like thin like line between like blacks and whites here, but also at the same time there's a massive amount of this like needing to create their own culture and sort of living outside of the American scope. And there's another great artist, or not artist, author that I want to bring up. We had mentioned Hegel before, but Frantz Fanon, if any of you guys haven't heard of him, I'd absolutely recommend him. One of my favorite books of his is White Skin, Black Masks. Or excuse me, no, Black Skin, White Masks, sorry. And in it, he basically says sort of the Hegelian slave master dialectic, well, that only works if the people are of the same skin color. If they're not of the same skin color, then the black person will, like the white person or the master in this instance, does not have to think of the black person as a person at all, regardless of what they are, because they don't see themselves reflected. So therefore, the slave has to do whatever they possibly can to try to emulate the master. And this is sort of the psychological position you see a lot of Black Americans in. And again, here we can even say across the whole western side of this planet. But no, it really is really intriguing in how Black culture has really been able to develop on their own, sort of in this isolated pockets because of like a whole bunch of systematic processes to keep them out of the participation in this society. And yet at the same time, they still get a lot of their culture cherry picked. And sort of going back to like what American culture is like a smorgasbord of all of these other cultures, and like specifically Black American culture, which is just sort of like given but not taken. Well, I should say that because we were saying Black culture has basically been severed. They had no choice but to take. And like in a sense, they were the first appropriators on this continent. Some would say, like even through the language, etc., and like the names that they carry. It's like these aren't African names; these are American names. But no, I've always found that really intriguing, and it's something that I really want to continue to investigate. And just the role that they play, specifically in the United States, because like, it's pretty wild. Brazil as well, but I'll have to learn Portuguese first before I jump in there. I just wanted to mention that.
That's great. Yeah, I looked up both of the authors and titles you mentioned and put them in the chat because I want people to be able to follow up on your recommendations. And part of what's fascinating is that the dialectic between privileged and marginalized people within a colonizer culture like ours is such that the privileged people want to simultaneously deny that they have privilege. They figure I have suffering, and if I were privileged, I have no suffering, so therefore I'm not privileged. They're not willing to embrace the understanding of what it means to be marginalized by comparison to another group. So on the one hand, they deny their existential condition and say, "Oh no, I'm normal, is what I am. I'm just normal. People should be like me. You know, I have a few problems, but otherwise everything's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I swear it's fine." That's sort of like the white experience in America. Is on the one hand, there are people like Native Americans and African Americans who have it so much worse, but on the other, and they can admit that, and if pressed, they don't actually want to change places because they don't want to be treated the way they're treating other people. But they're also in denial about it and don't want to admit that it's the case. What neither of the two modes that a privileged person switches back and forth between there allows them to understand is that the people they've been marginalizing have had to solve the problems of culture that privileged people haven't solved. It's one of the things that's interesting. Marx is, I think the saying goes that Marx is not a Marxist, and if you read Marx, you'll find that most Marxists would disagree with Marx about a great many things, and Marx would have a lot to say about the people who do things in his name. So he had a whole bunch of philosophical writing, for example, that doesn't get enough attention. And one of the things that he talks about is that, contrary to the way that it's portrayed in contemporary Marxism, Marx's perspective on the class struggle is not that it's between the people who get what they want and the people who don't. It's not that capitalists live a healthy life and that the proletariat lives an oppressed life. He says what happens is that two halves of what people need to be whole human beings are split artificially. And the capitalists get one side of it and the proletarians get the other side of it, and they're both miserable. And they both try to fill it in different ways. They're both confused about their condition because of the false consciousness of being inside of this ideology and not being able to look at it from an Archimedean standpoint. But that basically the rewards of interacting with the world with your hands and with your labor and being able to create change directly yourself is something that human beings need biologically. That we solve problems together and individually, but we actually do it is something that any proletariat knows, because that's our life. It's, it's like the only way we get to have a house is if we solve problems for somebody else for money. So we're constantly solving problems with our own hands, and we know that we can do things. And we may be unhappy, and we may be miserable, and we may not be educated enough or get enough health care. There may be missing all these things, but we get this constant feedback from the world, from interacting directly with it. And that someone who makes his life by doling out money as an abstract resource to allow people to survive just so long as they continue to labor on his behalf is cut off completely from what it means to engage directly with the world as a productive, creative person. And as a result, the rich person too has an enormous hole inside himself that makes him a half person. He's not living a fulfilled life. It's a shell of a life. Like you said, husk. I love that choice of words. It's a different shaped husk, but it's the complementary husk we've all got the same problem with not having a whole culture, with having a fragmented thing that's here. So
the culture is about political correctness as far as the privilege that you mentioned, denying the privilege, but making sure you continue to use it.
Yes.
It's reduced. Much of the culture is reduced to PC, but does not really reflect a paradigm change.
Yeah, Marx and talked about this idea that he talked about bourgeois culture, which is a phrase that gets bantered about, but people don't really understand what he meant by it, and they use it to mean other things now. But what he meant was, if you own everything, you own the means of production, and you have more wealth than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. And you don't work for a living to create things in the world, not real things. You don't really solve direct problems. You're in a, what was it? What do I want to say? You are aware of how much you have to lose. And so what you create as a substitute for culture when interacting with other capitalists is a mode in which the most important commandment is that you will not rock the boat. It creates this desperate conservatism not to upend things, because you don't want to be treated the way you're treating other people. Right? In this way, capitalism is a specialization of colonizer culture and coercion culture generally, which is when your way of life is, I get to have things because I treat other people badly. You create a relationship in which the thing you desperately don't want more than anything else is to be treated the way you treat other people. And so it leads to what you're talking about with bourgeois culture, where there is this kind of political correctness and politeness that results from a desire not to upend the boat. You don't want to antagonize the other people who have the power to overturn things. And you certainly don't want to antagonize the vast majority of people who you've been treating bad, but who, for whatever reason, haven't yet turned the boat over. So there's this kind of walking on eggshells thing that goes on as a replacement for culture.
Yeah, this is
and building walls.
Yes.
But the owner, you have to build walls with everybody, even with your own family, because the more you have, like you noticed, there is more to be envied. And you know that your friends will be friends as long as you hold your power and your money status. But the ownership now in this ecology of information is the ownership of labor, of other people's lives, not just of material possessions. And that's the worst, because it's another form of slavery now. Where, especially in this capitalism where you get healthcare, you deserve healthcare only if you are employed, right?
Well,
work or die. It's like gig slavery. It's like, I don't even commit to give you a hovel and some clothes. I commit to give you nothing, and I'll drop you at any moment I feel like it. But for the moment, if you'll labor for me, I'll dole out these little crumbs until I'm tired of you and then go away. It's a really sick relationship to be in. So what's interesting about it is, if you look at what people with a lot of money spend their time doing when they're not working, they engage in quote unquote cultural events. right? They go to these benefits, they go to nonprofit fundraising things. They go to the opera. They go to the ball game. They spend their money on things that make them feel like
entertainment.
Well, that's the thing, right? It's entertainment masquerading as culture.
Mm-hmm.
And Hollywood thinks of itself as a culture factory.
Yeah.
They believe they're generating culture because they can't distinguish entertainment from culture either any more than the rest of us can. That filling the void for a couple of hours and maybe for a day or two while you're still in the glow over just having seen Star Wars for the first time. But eventually you're still back with, well, how am I going to feed myself? And what if I get sick? How am I going to get healthcare? All the basic things that a culture has to do that's not being taken care of by the entertainment.
Yeah,
This is
I've got a
definitely-
question. I've got a question about this. It's been a couple of time I wanted to ask. We said earlier that ideology is something we can't really see when we are inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can't really reflect on it because we are like in a fish in a box, in a box, an aquarium. I was wondering if like the price of life, like the value we put to life, especially earlier we said, oh, it's terrible. Some elderly are dying because of the virus and so on, or we are saying, oh, those people don't have healthcare. This is terrible and so on. But in some culture, like death is just part of life, and this is like an eternal cycle, and so it's not sad to die. It's just part of life, and you will go to heaven and so on. So it's so I was wondering if here it wasn't like our Western ideology that were at play when we consider life at all costs as something that is really valuable. Like, I mean, if even like regarding the old people, like if a person die at 95 years old, some people will say, okay, it was like a great life compared to someone who die at 30 years old. But in other culture, it will be the other way around. It will be, oh, this is a baby. It isn't worth anything because it has no experience. And this person that is 95 years old has so much experience. It's so valuable. So it will be like such a pity. So yeah, I was wondering if like this value we link to life is not part of an ideology we have.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a really good question. There's a couple of ways to answer it. From the Navajo perspective, which Ayala was bringing up when she talked about the elderly passing away and taking the culture with them when they go, what's happening there is that in the Navajo way of life, the elders are precious. They're the repositories of lore, and it's only after people get to a sufficient age and level of experience that they begin to acquire knowledge about the ceremonials that you do to help people recover from war or from rape or from whatever it is they're trying to get over. And so if someone dies before their time in Navajo culture, you might entirely lose a ceremony. It might be gone forever. And that's happened. We have records of Navajo ceremonials that were used to recover from all kinds of, traumatic life events that the Navajo don't have anymore. They know their names, they know what they were for, they know roughly what it involved, but the ceremony's gone because, during Trail of Tears or Long March or, whatever trauma happened to the Navajo people, they lost the wrong people at the wrong time, and the intergenerational transmission was severed. So to them, to lose an old person is different than what it means in contemporary American West, with the Anglo culture, what they call the Bilagana, the people who fight all the time. And the thing about Bilagana is that when our people get old, we put them away in a nursing home so we don't have to deal with how difficult they are. And then when they die, we're sad, but it's also a relief. So when you talk about how much we value life, the thing about Western culture is that we simultaneously value it very highly and not at all. We're like nihilists trying to reconcile the fact that on the one hand, biologically, we care about each other. But on the other hand, people are just disposable resources you use to make a profit. And so if you have to, bomb or destroy some country elsewhere in the world to pick up rubber or petroleum or, whatever element it is you need to make your microprocessors for your iPhones you're going to sell next year, then most Americans don't know, don't care, and it's just fine with them. But if it affects them personally, or someone that they know or think they know or care about, then suddenly life's precious to them. So we have a sort of hit or miss relationship when it comes to valuing life. And it's one of the things that distinguishes a legitimate culture from an anti-culture, is that we can't make up our minds about it. And we're not sure where we come down about it. But the Navajo know exactly what they mean about, if somebody dies at a given age, exactly what is the nature of the loss to the people and to the society around them.
I think that's a good.
Go ahead.
I think that's a good thing to bring up. What cultures and what people of ideology, how they attach, the value of life. Because I mean, I felt like I grew up culturalist, and all I knew is value of life was materialism. That's what I thought, growing up. But what I come to find out, the value of life is just self-work. Just you get to the place where you can obtain a value of life, because you're chasing a value of life until you find yourself within. Because I never even thought about different cultures or different places on the earth. I never thought that anybody would value life differently over ideology or culture-based society. That's a good topic.
Yeah, I see there's a the distinction between culture and ideology within a culture, and the culture is life enhancing and promotes life and so forth, but the ideology is controlling and manipulative, right? So we have a lot of we have an intellectual culture of ideas in our cultural history, and some of them are ideologies that have been used to control people. So what is the distinction? Like someone mentioned that like Freud is an ideology. Is it an ideology, or is it something a set of ideas that that have become part of the culture and that can be used to enhance one's well-being?
I think ideology traps it traps you, but I think that maybe now that we're discussing it, it's making me ponder. I kind of think that people that have too much ideology value life a little less, maybe, because they feel trapped. They're forced into some form of belief system, and maybe they don't really even want that, or maybe they do want that. I don't know. I just feel like growing up around people that were Christian and whatnot, I just feel like they only valued life about materialism. They didn't value like actual life.
Yeah, that gets at the Greek thing, the Delphi thing about to what extent do people know what they value? How well do they understand who they really are? What kind of direction is there between the idealism that they espouse, their ideals, versus their actual lived principles that they carry out in the world, and when are they out of sync with each other? So JB, you're right to bring up this diversity. And part of what's interesting is that our challenge, lacking a culture, being stuck with an anti-culture and trying to figure out where do we go from here, is that as we look around at the diversity of cultures that are out there, if we really study them and get to understand them, we'll find what you're saying. We'll find that how they put together their cosmology and human life within it, its place and its meaning, is different in different cultures. And if you were to just start cherry picking what you thought would be the most attractive features of different cultures and put them together because you thought that would make a good culture, we'd almost certainly be missing some of the subtle relationships between the different parts of the culture. Why in some cultures, when if the elderly get to a certain age, they voluntarily choose to die because they're living in resource constrained areas, and they've passed on what they need to pass on at the time that they've done it, and they need to make way for the youth. Versus in another place where the exact opposite is the case, where you want your elders to live as long as possible because the transmission of knowledge takes so long that if it's interrupted, it's a catastrophe. It's easy. The temptation as moderns is to try to reduce things to parts. Science and schism and scissors and shingle splitting into pieces. Analysis is our default mode for understanding the world, and it's what Mary Shelley, put the knife right into the middle of in Frankenstein, when she said the problem with the modernist worldview is that it's indistinguishable from thinking you could collect a bunch of parts of different corpses, sew them together, and have a person. That there's a hole there that needs to be present for it to function correctly, and that these cultures that have evolved and changed and developed, no question, but have evolved over thousands upon thousands of years in a place so that they match that place and they're well fitted to it. Are completely different than what happens when we just guess at what we ought to have as a culture. And we start intellectually trying to select from here and there and cobble things together. We get taught things through our mistakes by nature, by the world, in a way that we can't anticipate, no matter how smart or creative we are. There's no shortcut for that process of cultural evolution. We could try to accelerate it some, like African Americans did, LGBTQ communities did, so forth, that we can try to help it along and do it on purpose and speed it up. But we can't actually do it in a snap, because whatever it is that we come up with won't be a sustainable thing until it has been tested by nature and reality. Until the world has had a chance to beat on it and break off the broken parts, and we've had a chance to grow into them in a healthier shape, we won't really have a culture. And that's what's so amazing about these indigenous cultures that have somehow survived and haven't been exterminated yet, that they've not only managed to survive for thousands of years and develop without being deliberately assaulted and attacked, which is a trick that we haven't managed, but that they're still here even when they are being assaulted and attacked and put under pressure. They've got this kind of survival capability and staying power as a culture that we don't understand how to design. And I don't know what the answer is, other than to run culture experiments, to do our best to study other cultures, to try things, to pull things together, and to run experiments and let the world teach us what works and what doesn't work.
I think I found the answer for myself, not necessarily, by testing nature or testing cultures, but now that I think about it, people with ideology, I feel like they value life a little less. I mean, people of strong culture, in the eastern, side of the world, I think they value life quite more than, our anti-culture in America. And I can relate to it because agnosticism, I didn't value life. I didn't. I didn't understand the universe. I really was going to ride it out till shit hit the fan or till I died, and then I'll find out then. But so I didn't value life without ideology. I didn't value life without a culture, and I didn't value life without religion or anything. So, I mean, I think that's my answer, that if you have ideology, you possibly could value life a little less. And if you have a strong culture, you could possibly value, life a little more than somebody without anything. I mean, because that was my experiences.
And it could be hard to read from the outside if you're looking at somebody else or some other culture and trying to figure out how they value life. It's so easy to get it wrong. An example of that is, in Western culture, we go for elaborate funerals and extravagant grief. This was especially popularized under the Victorian era. Queen Victoria's, sort of lifelong mourning for her husband after he died kind of set the tone for this idea that grief should go on and be public and visible, and you need to do all these things to make everybody understand that you'll just never be the same. In the Navajo culture, they value life, no doubt.
Absolutely.
But when someone dies, they do not drag it out. You are supposed to immediately get down to the business of washing them and preparing them. And then you bury their body and then you walk away. And you do not, cover yourself with grief about them. You don't talk about them all the time. You don't constantly try to make people remember them. That's actually considered rude and sort of life denying. And it's not that they don't care. They carry that person in their heart for the rest of their lives.
Mhm.
And they might tell stories about them from time to time. But it's the culture is oriented differently than ours is about how you express the way that you value life. And you could see, looking at that, how easy it would be to misinterpret it. But it's the thing anthropologists always have to wrestle with, which is, how can you describe another culture when you're not part of it? How can you understand what the things mean to the people who are actually going through it?
I feel a strong culture has, obviously more connection to the universe. I mean, every culture that I've studied, at least, they have a lot more connections. They ride on a higher vibration. Their consciousness is higher. They meditate. I mean, like Western culture and like Christianity and religions like that. I mean, we have prayer, and I didn't even know. I didn't understand what prayer was, and I really don't now, because it really doesn't look like anything to me other than affirmation time. I think meditation, it definitely is more of a path to, getting, happiness and value on life versus, the Western, ideas.
A little personal story, I guess, is my grandpa Fred, my dad's dad. He grew up in a logging town among the redwoods, in the southern Oregon, northern California area. And his family had been loggers for a while. And they knew all the trees. And they knew them at a level that's sort of inconceivable for most of us. Like, they could tell by the plants that were growing around them or where that tree grew. They could tell you things about what was deep underground. So they're like, that kind of tree can only grow there if it's got access to water. It looks dry here, but we know that there's water under the surface because that tree wouldn't be here otherwise. It simply can't grow under dry conditions. So that they could read the land and they could read the changes in climate and the variations that are possible. Just when they walked around through a forest, it was like a book. Everything was speaking to them and telling them not just little scientific trivialities. It was telling them basic survival information. They knew plants that you and I would walk past. They knew you can eat that. That's edible. That's medicinal. And he tried to teach me that as a grown-up. And it took me a while to clue in that that's what he was doing. And when I finally realized it, what occurred to me is that from a tree reading perspective, I was illiterate. I mean, I prided myself on reading Shakespeare and Tolkien and Jane Austen and all these other things. I was literate when it came to the books that we made out of trees. But when it came to the trees themselves, which had volumes to teach us, every single tree, every place it is, has things to tell us about where we are and what happens here. I was illiterate. I couldn't read. I didn't know what these things meant. And so I retroactively embarked upon a program to try to learn the native trees and how they work and what they meant. And in doing so, I was engaging in a process that I call indigenizing. We have a word for colonizing, which is you go someplace that you never were and don't belong, and you take it and you settle, and you shoot anybody who comes and says you don't belong here, including all the animals that you used to walk through there. You kill them too. Yeah. This is mine, right? That's to colonize. But to indigenize is to say, where the hell am I? And how do I connect to this land? And how do I become part of a cognitive, mental, emotional, lifeway relationship with it so that I actually belong here? How do I put down roots, not to take the place, but to become part of it, so that it's not that it's my land, it's that I'm its person. I'm
one with the land. You become one with the land. You become, or the rainforest or whatever you're talking about. It also goes back to what you were saying is, capitalism or like CEOs, they don't have the hands-on. They don't work. And that I feel like that is that gives you that connection, as a civilization, to become one with whatever, part of the planet or the universe that you're, involved in. I
And
can relate to that.
the Lakota and the Nakota and the Dakota, they talk, I connected with a lot of people during Standing Rock, and they talk about the way since then, I get to see their Facebook feeds, and we share things. And one of the things that I got to see is that it's considered a basic part of life, if you're indigenous, to watch all the plants around you as you walk around. And medicinal plants and edible plants, you should collect some of them. Not like clear cut the way a modern would do, but a little bit. You should collect a little bit and get to know it and learn it and taste it and make jams and dry herbs and make medicines. And you sort of start creating this relationship in which, instead of these things being wallpaper that you glance at and appreciate as you go by, they start to become part of your day-to-day living. And that's part of the process of weaving yourself into the land and being one with it.
This whole culture thing is going to have me all sorts of boggled in thinking, because I was just thinking, like being in an anti-culture, in America, I purposely put myself, growing up, especially in Atlanta, I purposely put myself as a minority all the time, consistently put myself in cultures, like the Hispanic culture, the African American culture. I just always did that because obviously I was striving for culture in an anti-culture environment. And those were the two main, cultures that I could gravitate toward, was the Hispanic community and the African American community. I felt like I connected with them because I had nobody to connect with the Caucasian, anti, civilization, thing going on.
Yeah, the land denying and life denying kind of ways that modernism embraces puts us in a difficult posture. And what's really hard is for those of us who sort of wake up one day and find ourselves in this existential situation.
Yeah.
My relationship to this land can never be the same as the Salish people, to whom it actually is their land. Absolutely. Right? Like every square inch of Seattle, every square inch of the United States is stolen. So I'm I didn't do the stealing, but I benefit from the stealing. And because of my skin color and acculturation into the anti-culture, my facility with it, I can occupy a privileged position in it, but it will never change the fact that none of this is mine. It could be mine legally, it could be mine emotionally or intellectually, but at a deep level, this is Salish land. This is, the Duwamish land, Suquamish land. And so it means that for those people who are the descendants of colonizers, one of the great challenges at a cultural level is, how can you be a whole person and have a whole culture, and which requires having this deep connection to the land when it's not your land? What's our role here? What ought we to do in order to be whole human beings who contribute in a sustainable way to, the human project? And I'm still struggling with that and trying to learn.
Did somebody just write that whose land is it really, or something? I don't know, what that was a question or something.
That was JB. Yeah, that's why I inverted it and said it's not that the land belongs to us, it's that we belong to the land. And
well, yeah, I mean, once you become, it's like a unity thing. Once you become one with something, whether it's the universe or the land, that's when it's yours, and a culture can obtain that, and an individual can. But just like you said, all the bloodshed, it's not our land because of that, because we took it, Right. I don't feel like we can become one with something that we took.
It's like the ancestors of the French. You have to go back a long way to find the people who colonized France and, are guilty of moving in and taking somebody else's land. You guys have been there a long time. I don't know how to break this to you. One of my favorite areas of study is that kind of borderline prehistory, right before history, where the very first people to start write records among the Greeks and the Romans and the Babylonians are saying, here's who was around when we got here. I love that stuff. I love studying the Basques and other folks. So, how long has it been since the Celts committed atrocities by colonizing Europe and kicking out the indigenous people? It's been a hell of a long time. But the Suquamish and Duwamish, that was just yesterday. I mean, it's now. It's like still where the genocide against them is actually still ongoing. You know, the Chief Seattle gave the land under duress to the United States under the condition that his people would have a reservation and would have fishing rights and all these things. And the United States agreed and then never recognized them as a tribe, never gave them a reservation, never gave them any of the things they're supposed to give them. So literally the injustice is still right here, and every cent of value that's generated in the economy here locally is basically a crime. So my existential situation as somebody from that anti-culture that's still an occupying force is not at all the same as the existential situation of someone living in France who has French ancestry. It's a very different situation.
Yeah, but in France, I think like we also have a problem of identity because we have this history with colonialistic lands we had in Africa,
right?
And we also, for economic reasons, like mostly for economic reason, even though it's not said, we imported a lot of African people in the 70s, 80s, 90s,
right.
to have cheap labor.
Right.
And now actually, especially from Algeria and all those Arabic countries of northern part of France. And so you have like really two kind of, you have like the people who consider themselves as French, and then you have the people who consider themselves as being colonized or something. And those are like a huge part of the population in France. It's estimated, I think we have around 10 million Muslim people. So it's like 1 out of 6 person. So it's, and so it's kind of divided, and the government try to play with it, I think for politician reasons, to divide, you know, like the electors, like the voters and so on.
Yeah.
So we also have like the French people are wondering if they are legitimate on their land, like if even French is like a language that should perdure in time, like relatively to English, or so there are like a lot of question arise like from a identity point of view in France, and it's really deep inside the society. Like you really have especially in suburbs where you have like there are many suburbs in France where you have maybe 90 to even 100% of the population that is from immigrant countries. So like really you have no French how to say this, that have been there like for many generations. They all imported, and we built some area for them in like big towers and so on to have cheap apartments and so on. And so those areas are kind of against like they're like states inside the states, and we've got like many of them. And so we've got more and more crimes related to cultural crime. Yeah, we've got more and more of them. And yeah, it's like a huge political fact in France.
Yes. I have another friend who lives in France, an expatriate from Seattle, and he shares these things with me a lot on Facebook. It's fascinating, and I know it's got to be really difficult. When I talk about the existential crisis situation of U.S. people living on the land that they live on, I'm more alluding to kind of in addition to the history of colonization and slavery and the other things that we've done. It's like how many scary movies, you know, when you're trying to figure out why are there demons, why is there a curse, why are all these terrible things happening, you know, like the film Poltergeist that Steven Spielberg had a hand in. It turns out, oh, I see, we built our house on an Indian graveyard. Well, that was our mistake right there. It's like it doesn't matter how good or bad we were after that point. We made this original sin so bad that really it's hard to know what you do next. It's like where do you go from here? And the problem in the United States is, you know, we all belong in Scotland or England or Germany or France or somewhere like that. And
None of us know.
we've been, you know, by our ancestors choosing to come here, we've been transplanted to a place that isn't ours. But we've been told by the law and by our anti-culture that we should treat it like it's ours, even while the descendants of the actual, you know, the actual heirs who are living in poverty and struggling today and who could benefit from all of these great things, you know, they're you know, kind of shoved off to the side. So, you know, I think in France, certainly all the things that you said are legit and that you have to struggle with. And you know, part of what you're wrestling with in France, we're like the children or grandchildren of Europe. And we have that same stuff to worry about, which is how much of what we consider our culture actually came from the medieval church or came from the Roman Empire or came from, you know, sort of this long multi-millennial history of conquest and colonization and, you know, people beating each other up and taking their land or enslaving each other. And it's been going on for so long that how today do we extricate ourselves from those patterns of getting what we want by coercing somebody else? You know, by like, can I outvote them and make them do it? And if they don't obey the vote, then the police will beat them. You know, it's like there is this kind of assumption that if we don't coerce people into doing the right thing, then they'll do the wrong thing. And we didn't think of that. That goes all the way back to Rome and before. I mean, that's been pouring into us through thousands of years of patterns of life. And so if we decided today that we wanted to do something different,
don't you think that it's also part of the human nature in general? Like, because you also have those phenomena that happen like with Japan, in China, like you always had some very powerful culture that try to take the most of other weaker culture, like in terms of military forces or economic forces.
Yes.
You always have war and conquests through history. It's not only like the Western world, there's also Asian, even in Africa, you have tribute who fight.
Yeah, that's right. It's colonizer cultures are evidently they're a potential within us because they've cropped up all over the world. And what's interesting is that if you study really closely China and Japan and Russia and other places, what you'll discover is they also have indigenous people. They also have indigenous cultures that were shoved to the side and whose land was taken by the colonizer culture that erupted in their midst. And so it's not just Native Americans and Australian Aborigines and the Maori. It's also, you know, the folks of northern Japan, the Ainu, right? And it's the people who live in the Amur Valley between Russia and Korea and China, where the Siberian tigers live. Now, there's all kinds of indigenous people there. There's indigenous people all along the coasts of Siberia and the Arctic Circle. They're in China, shoved to the borders and the edges all over the place. And in many cases, those were the dominant people who lived there before the colonizer culture erupted and decided it was going to take everything. So this pattern has been recreated all over the world. But I think as members of a colonizer culture, it's easy for us to slip into assuming that all cultures function that way, that there weren't any exceptions. Whereas when we look around the world, what we actually see is that it only takes one or two colonizer cultures in an area to dominate and shove away and try to extinguish all the many diverse cultures that used to live there that were not colonizer cultures and that didn't do that to each other. It's like a kind of pandemic, a cultural pandemic that spreads and erases the evidence that things used to be different.
You think that could have possibly created like the colonizing cultures? Do you think that could have possibly created like a lot of the issues that the, you know, anti-culture, you know, places are?